Paul Anthony Wallace, back with us.
It was my work as a theological educator that got me into the world of paleo contact. That's the theory of ET contact in the deep past. And it was the aspect of Bible translation and finding that the root meanings of key words carry a totally different story to the one we're all familiar with from Sunday school.
What has changed in the past few months? It seems to be getting very serious these days.
Yes, last year really was incredible. I think there are still a lot of people who respond to any mention of ETs with ridicule, but so much was revealed and authenticated last year in a conversation between the U.S. Congress and the Pentagon. And the conversation was surrounding secrecy that surrounds the Pentagon's program of reverse engineering of materials obtained from UAP or UFO retrievals. And in the public hearing that happened on July the 26th, we were hearing information such as we'd never heard before at that level, authenticated at that level. So we were hearing about the fact that 40 witnesses had given sworn testimony to Thomas Monheim, the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community, reporting details of materials, what was retrieved, when and where, the names of Pentagon officials who were blocking intelligence sharing, the names of people who'd run the program, and, here's the punchline, the present locations of entire craft and their pilots and other mysterious non-human biologics. Now, people who've been following the story wouldn't be too surprised by that, but we've never heard that kind of information referred to at this senior level. And everything that was spoken by the key witnesses had to be cleared by the Department of Defense Office of Pre-Publication Service Review and by the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community. So all the information we heard amounts to a semi-official disclosure regarding the existence of that information. And I have not seen that level of disclosure in my lifetime.
Paul, we make reference of you being a paleo contact expert. What does that mean?
Paleo contact is the hypothesis that our ancestors in the deep past had contact with visitors from other civilizations, extraterrestrial civilizations. And I find evidence for that in indigenous story, ancient texts, and ancestral narratives all around the world. As I say, my way in was through the root meanings of key words in the Bible, but since then I've gone around the world. I've listened to African story, Mesoamerican story, Norse story, Filipino story. You can go anywhere on the planet, and there's a folkloric layer of story that seems to carry very similar memories of contact in the deep past.
During the congressional hearings in July of last year, they seemed to be surrounded around secrecy surrounding the program. What is, in quotes, what is the program? Who runs it? How long has it been around? Something's going on.
Well, in 2019, the Pentagon stepped forward and admitted that it has had in place units that investigate retrieved materials from UFOs or UAPs. Those units have existed in one form or another for more than 70 years. And that account was confirmed by Haim Eshed, who is the Brigadier General who for 28 years was Israel's chief of space security. And it was also authenticated by Alain Juillet, who is the former chief of French intelligence. So for the first time in more than 70 years, the Pentagon is saying there are ET craft, there are UFOs, there are non-human biologics that fly them, and we've been investigating them for more than 70 years. But the question that follows on from that, when the pilots are referenced, as they've been in that hearing, as they have been in Haim Eshed's book, The Universe Beyond the Horizon, we want to know, are those pilots alive? Does that imply a conversation? Are we in collaboration, as Haim Eshed said? And when those questions were asked in the hearing, that was when the key witness, David Grush, said, well, that's something I can't answer publicly. That would have to be in a SCIF, a secure compartment information facility. That's the information we're all on tenterhooks now waiting to hear.
Did this program, when you said 70 years ago, start with the Eisenhower administration? I've always heard rumors about that.
Yes, there have been rumors for a very long time around a dental appointment that President Eisenhower made in the middle of the night in Palm Springs in 1954, and the urban legend has been that was a meeting to do with compacts being made with ET visitors. But in my new book, The Invasion of Eden, I argue that what was actually happening is that Eisenhower was being read in to agreements that were already in place from the administration of his predecessor, President Truman. And in The Invasion of Eden, I show my evidence for coming to that conclusion. So it's in the 1940s that the current iteration of contact took place, and that same timeline has been authenticated by Brigadier General Hayer Mashed. So I take that seriously.
So this information's been around, Paul, for a long, long time.
A lot of this information has been out there, sort of in the air. People following the story would know, but it really wasn't until last year that there was an official authentication of that time frame, of those units, of the objective materials that those units are investigating. And briefly, it was on the TV. You can watch the whole hearing on YouTube still, and I'd encourage everyone to do that, because, as I say, we've not seen this kind of information handled so publicly at such a senior level since 1947.
Paul, in this country, we have a couple congressmen who are really concerned about the possibility that the Pentagon knows more than they're telling us. I guess that's a good thing for us, right?
Yes, I applaud them. You're talking about Tim Burchett and Andy Ogles, and I applaud them for pushing this story. They have been read into some of that information that was only for a skiff, and their point is that these issues are so important that they have to be the business of Congress. They have to be of public interest. If there is a presence here that there's no way we can engage with militarily, successfully, that is all our business. But what I would add to what they're saying is that if we frame the whole topic of contact with ET visitors as war or conflict, I don't think that's helpful. We are the ones trying to shoot them out of the sky, not vice versa. And when we go to ancestral story, our ancestors tell us we're in a whole spectrum of company. Some may be alarming, but a great deal is here for our benefit and always to support humanity make the next leap forward. And I believe that's the situation we're in today.
Do you think that we are going to get disclosure eventually, Paul?
I think it's going to be drip, drip, drip. I think we're seeing the Pentagon in a two-step kind of pattern at the moment. So, for instance, in 2017, there was the unofficial leaking of the footage of the Tic Tac craft engaged with by the USS Nimitz. And then 2 years later, after the Pentagon had been able to observe the public reaction, they were able to say that's all true, we confirm that, and we've had units in place for more than 70 years. So I think we're in that kind of a pattern. 2023, we had a lot of information that was semi-official disclosure. So by my reading, I think a lot more will be coming out in around 2026, that if we really pursue that information, really will be earth-shattering.
Now, in your book, The Invasion of Eden, you spend some time talking about Hawaii. Tell us about that.
I find whenever I start a new book, it's almost as if the book writes itself. I start to find myself in conversation with people who have deep ancestral knowledge, and I love sitting at the feet of elders of traditional cultures. And as I listened to my friends from Hawaii, specifically from Molokai, I was hearing their stories that reflect ancient contact, ancient invasions and annexations. They have these amazingly rich stories of the Mo'o and the Ahumanu. And what interested me is that when we get to their stories that sound like ET invasions, they're not talking about Star Wars in space or air battles in the sky. Their elders would say, if there's a new layer of governance over your society, it will reflect in shifts in your culture. And so those stories talk about the machinization of your culture, the dehumanization of your culture, making it harder for people to be self-sufficient or to work on the land or to work for each other, nudging things further forwards until we're all infantilized, working for superiors, slaving for money. And it's those kind of cultural shifts that the ancient Hawaiian stories reflect on. And they say if you see uber policies lasting for generations that are really not favorable towards human beings, that might be a clue that you've got some forces pulling strings that are not human, that don't have fellow feeling with human beings driving them. And so it was that cultural aspect of the story that really gripped me and kept me listening to my Hawaiian friends.
Tell us about the title of the book, The Invasion of Eden.
The Invasion of Eden. Well, I've called it that because the conversation that happened in that hearing had a lot of people contacting me and saying, are we about to be invaded? Are Andy Ogles and Tim Burchett right that there's an existential threat hanging over us? And I realized I had to write a book to address that question. Are we about to be invaded, or have we secretly been invaded already? And as in all my previous Eden books, I go back to the ancient wisdom, the wisdom of our ancestors, and realize that they have prepared us for moments like these so that we won't be paralyzed by terror and alarm, but to know that there's always a spectrum of company. And so the question isn't, are we in contact? It's, who are we conversing with? Who are we doing business with? Knowing that there is always help here to support the human story. Are those the factions that we have our compacts and agreements with, or are we bound by agreements made in the 1940s that might not still serve our best interests? And it's all those kind of issues that I explore in The Invasion of Eden.
And what their motivation might be, Paul.
Exactly, because a spectrum of demographics visiting us means a spectrum of agendas. And some may be to do with supporting human beings, some may be because they want the resources of the planet. Some may regard human beings as resources. Some might not like human beings very much, but some, I believe, have a deeply parental relationship towards the human race and have been with us for a very long time to ensure that we can survive uncertain times.
Do you think this knowledge is being shared with other countries, or are we keeping it to ourselves? How widespread is it?
Well, yes, are we keeping it to ourselves was a big part of the discussion in that congressional hearing. David Grush identified there's a big problem of intelligence units not even sharing their information within the U.S. intelligence community. When we heard from Hayam Ashed, he indicated that the U.S. covert government and Israeli covert government are in conversation, are collaborating together, and he hinted that other countries around the world may be in similar processes. But other countries don't have the trillions of black budgets, trillions of dollars of black budgets that the states have to push the program forward and to really meet the bar in terms of becoming spacefarers. And so for that reason, I think it's very worthwhile keeping our eye on that particular ball where the Pentagon's program has reached. How close are they towards making that technological breakthrough?
If that breakthrough occurs, what do you think it's going to do for humanity?
Hayam Ashed said this, and I know Ed Mitchell believed this, Ed Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, that our observers are waiting for us to become spacefarers. We know from listening to Jacques Vallée, Eric Davis, senior physicist, Gary Nolan, a Nobel Prize-nominated microbiologist, that what we're trying to do is reverse engineer materials that create a little space-time bubble, because that's what these craft are made of. That's what enables them to ping in and out of our airspace and travel through subspace or through wormholes. As soon as we can do that, then the whole cosmos is accessible to us. And Hayam Ashed is saying we're being observed so that when we reach that point, all of a sudden we will change. We will become citizens of the universe. We will go from being the studied, the observed, the abducted, to being fellow spacefarers. And Ed Mitchell always used that phrase of becoming ready to take our place in the community of spacefaring civilizations. So I think everything changes in that moment. That's why we need to shine as much scrutiny on the program as possible, because that breakthrough belongs to all of us, and it will change the human experience profoundly.
There was a bill by Senator Marco Rubio that tried to force disclosure, but that crashed and burned, didn't it?
It did crash and burn, and I was not hopeful that you could really legislate to outgun the Pentagon. I just don't think that's the way forward. And I know many were disappointed by that, but I think that with Thomas Monheim and Dopser in a forward-leaning position. Clearly, they are happy for more to come into the public conversation. I think what that sets us up for is a continual drip, drip, drip of information that, if you pay attention to it, really is earth-shattering. So I think that's what's going to happen. I think more information is going to come, but I don't think we can force it out of the Pentagon through legislation, and I think that's what we saw last year.
Tell me about an upcoming movie you've been working on with Matt LaCroix.
Oh, I'm really excited about this. Next month, I will be flying to Turkey to join up with Matt LaCroix, and we will be meeting together with other researchers to explore the region of Lake Van. And what's interesting about that region is that there are artifacts there that possibly take us to a civilization prior to the last ice age. But when we get to those artifacts, there is information carved on them that gives us an idea of what the hands-on, eyes-on experience of contact was for that prior civilization. And I show the beginning of that journey in the invasion of Eden, and I show that many stories of human origins begin in that part of the world, in Turkey, in ancient Armenia. I believe that the Abraham story comes from there. It's there that Noah's Ark landed. It's there from which the human race was repopulated. It was there that we learned to build with stone. It's there that we learned Iron Age technology. It has one of the most ancient languages in the world. So we're starting there because so many vectors point there, and I believe they point to paleo contact prior to the last ice age.
Do we have anything to be worried about with these ETs?
Potentially, yes, because when we read the stories of the ancients and listen to indigenous story, there is always an alarming end of the spectrum. There are stories of species who've come in order to colonize and to exploit the planet. But for me, the balance is our helpers are always at hand. We've never been extinguished. I think if beings had come wanting to get rid of us, that would have happened long ago. So I think we need to be thoughtful. We need to weigh the information we're being told. We need to be careful in our exopolitics, our sort of ET diplomacy. But I do believe we have a lot of help at hand to ensure that things go well for us rather than go badly.
Did you ever think that your days as a church participant would come to this, what it is right now?
No, it took me completely by surprise. I mean, I really thought I was just doing some more Bible study to prepare myself for future sermons. But once I really got into the root meanings of the key words and found this other story opening up, it was like taking the red pill in the Matrix. A whole new world opened up. And I could see that many of the ancient God stories of the Bible are really restatements of the stories from out of ancient Sumeria and Babylonia and Arcadia and Assyria. And those are not God stories. They're stories of sky people, or what we would call aliens or extraterrestrials or astronauts. And it did take me by surprise, and it's taken me a lot of catching up with myself to think through what that means for my faith in God, for my following of Jesus as a Christian believer. But it's been an incredibly enriching journey, and I still feel that I am in ministry because I am working with people every day from week to week who are on a similar journey, trying to get their heads around this information and what it means for their lives, for their faith, for our potential as human beings. So I see that as my ministry these days, and I like to quote John Wesley by saying, "The world is my parish." That's really what's happened through publishing books like The Invasion of Eden.
What do you think the reaction will be to the book once it gets out there in the public?
I think many people will be excited by it. It will help many people get through questions and confusion over how to read what has happened. I hope it will be provocative to people. I hope that it will encourage senior religious leaders to catch up with what's happening, because I think many of the churches have failed to engage with this, and they're going to struggle to pass to people through the turbulence that will follow more disclosures. And so it's a book I hope will help many people around the world catch up with what is happening, get beyond a state of alarm, and get into a place of, all right, what am I going to do? How am I going to live differently in the light of this?
Paul, what do you think the reaction will be of people if government ever comes out and says, yes, it's been happening? Sorry we had to keep it quiet, but we're telling you now it's real. What do you think the reaction to the public would be?
polling in the States suggests that about 67% of the American public, if they were told that by, say, the president, they would say, yes, we'd more or less worked that out. And I think really because of programs like yours, George, and because there's a long tradition of local radio in the USA, a lot of this has been discussed and gossiped over the last decade, and a lot of people have worked out what's going on. So I don't think we're going to see the sort of blind panic that we're seeing in the three-body problem, for instance, on Netflix. I think most people will say this doesn't come as a surprise.
Tell us about your YouTube channel, Paul.
Oh, the fifth kind has been so exciting. I worked with my UK collaborator, Anthony Barrett, and we put out videos about exactly this kind of material, ancestral narratives, ET contact, and it's grown so fast. We're at, I think, 1,004,000 at the moment on our main channel, and then about 130,000 on our subsidiary channels. And the response we're getting to our videos tells me that there is an appetite all around the world. I mean, I'm in conversation with people every day from every country I can think of around the world who want this kind of information, who want to think it through, who want to talk to me and say, yes, I knew this because I had this experience, or because I've seen this in ancient texts, or because I did traditional initiation and this happened. And it shows me that there is this amazing groundswell of interest and appetite in all the topics we've been talking about tonight.
Are you concerned about the lack of disclosure? Does it bother you?
Well, it does, but I think we need to avoid getting into a place of exasperation, which is very easy to do, and I don't think it helps disclosure if we sort of address the Pentagon and say we're very angry with you for the secrets you keep, or if we address the aerospace industries and say we're very angry that you're not sharing this intelligence. I think that's the wrong message. I think the success of the aerospace industry is all our success, and our message needs to be we are ready to be included in this conversation. We are ready for more information to come out. I think that's the kind of maturity we need to show if we want more information to flow. But I think frustration and anger doesn't get us anywhere.
Paul Wallace with us. His book is called The Invasion of Eden. This is amazing work, Paul. Paul, when you first started researching the Eden series, where did you go? How did you know how to start?
I was very fortunate that when I was growing up, my dad worked for the aviation industry, for civil aviation. And so I got to travel a lot of the world and see ancient sites and experience incredible things. I was also very fortunate that my parents were quite broad thinkers, and they left books like Eric von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods lying around the house. So by the time I came to write The Invasion of Eden, I've been thinking about a lot of data for decades and decades, and the ideas have been forming in my mind, and I just reached the point of connecting the dots and seeing a picture and realizing this changed things so profoundly that I had to make a research path of it and then turn it into a book, so I'm sharing the journey with others. But it's almost as if all the experiences of my life through the decades had led up to that moment of issuing Escaping from Eden.
And as you continued writing the books, one followed the other. You had it like in sequence?
Well, that's right. I didn't have a plan for the books mapped out in advance, but once I'd finished Escaping from Eden, I realized I needed to follow up with a book that says, so what? What difference does it make if it's a populated universe? What difference does it make if we were created by God, or if we were created by God and then adapted by others? What's the implication for you and me today? What's the take-home? And so that produced The Scars of Eden. By the time I'd finished that book, I realized that the place to go to find all the answers to these incredible questions was the folkloric layer of story and cultures all around the world. So in Echoes of Eden, I went back there. And so you can see bit by bit, I'm sort of following my nose as the subject unfolds. And by the end of Echoes of Eden, I realized I had to circle back to the Bible and ask, well, if those stories weren't about God and religion in the way we thought, what was it our ancestors wanted to know? So that produced the Eden Conspiracy, and then the hearing happened. And so I'm on a journey and I'm discovering from book to book where it is I'm going and what I'll be sharing with the reader in the next chapter.
What fascinates you the most about the subject line, Paul?
I think for me, it's the question of where do we go next? What are we capable of? A different story of human origins has implications for human potential. What are you and I capable of? What kind of lives can we lead? And in the Invasion of Eden, I asked that question at an individual level and at a social level. If we are struggling with questions of who's running the world, who's the 1%, who's pulling the strings of the 1%, while we're trying to puzzle that out, you and I still have to work out how to have a good life and how to thrive. And I find answers to those questions as well in ancestral story and in biblical story. And the idea that we can have a better human experience, that's what really motivates me.
Paul, always great talking to you. That's amazing. Thank you so much. We've got your website linked up at coasttocoastam.com.
Back with Gary Wayne, the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, Parts 1 and 2. So much ground to cover. Gary, I want to jump ahead, if we can, to Babylon.
Sure. I mean, Babylon is a very important piece of understanding end-time prophecy. So when we understand Babylon, we want to understand that there are basically four different aspects to what Babylon is. First thing is it's a universal religion. The mother, or the Queen of Heaven, that sits on the end-time empire that's recorded in Revelation 12, 13, and 17, the 10 kings, or the 10 horns and the 10 toes with other prophecies. She rides these beasts of empires with this last one that rises in the end. And so she's going to be the one that's going to bring about this empire. So a universal mystery religion, as she is described as Mystrion or Mystery Babylon. And it's an initiatory ancient religion, and it's the old religion. It's the pantheons that were before the flood that I call in Book 1 Enochian mysticism with your religion, that merged with the knowledge of the seven sacred sciences and the knowledge of the gods to create it, and then crosses the flood beginning with Nimrod and all the religions that come down through the various empires that we call beast empires in biblical prophecy from Daniel 7. You can call them metallic as well, but beast is more the imagery that comes forward into the book of Revelation. It is the part of the organizational structure of the bloodline Nephilim kings, or Rephaim kings after the flood, along with this mystical religion. And so Babylon's going to be in place. We're also told Babylon is a city 9 times in the book of Revelation, so it's a city. So I think it's going to be Babylon located at the original city of Rome with the 7 hills of Rome, and likely centered at Palatine, where the Sibylline prophecies were utilized by the Roman Empire. Understanding the end-time empire comes out of the original empire of Rome, so it comes out of the ashes.
So we're familiar with the 7 hills in Rome,
Yep.
But there are 7 hills of Babylon mentioned in the Bible, aren't there?
Babylon sits on 7 hills, as Revelation 17, and is 7 kings. It's both, as it talks about Revelation 17. And biblically, we understand that as the seat of idolatry, as you take Babylon, meaning back to the original Greek there, and that Babylon comes out of the source word Babel. So it's the same religion. Another Antichrist-type figure imposed this antediluvian religion on the Noahites after the flood, and Nimrod is very much an Antichrist archetypical type of figure after the flood. Babylon can also be a geopolitical organization, and it will be the one that permits these 10 kings, these 10 groups of nations that will form for the end time and will control them. So much so those 10 kings are going to partner at the midpoint of the last 7 years with Antichrist to overthrow Babylon, because Babylon has grown rich. And Babylon will also be the beast system that's put in place for Antichrist to take over and take to another level. And in this system, Babylon grows rich as she controls all of the trade and the commerce around the world. So we need to understand Babylon in its different compartments and a precursor to Antichrist rising. And expect Antichrist to rise amongst Babylon and the prophets of Babylon as they're converting everybody through prophecies of doom to convert to the true religion or be destroyed from the face of the earth.
You mentioned Nimrod, descendant of Noah. Was Nimrod a giant? Was he descended from giants?
No, he's actually a son of Cush, but he's described as a mighty one, as a Gibor. We do not get giants that are listed as patriarchs in the Table of Nations. So Nimrod is the son of Cush, son of Ham, son of Noah. We understand that he became a Gibborim, and that's very interesting language, and that's the Hebrew word chalal, and it means defiled and violated and disavowed or broke a covenant or the word given, and usually broken in conjunction through rituals and sexual rituals. So what he does is he breaks his leadership vows and introduces the same religion that was before the flood, and also the religion of the giants who he's making reputation amongst in defending the Noahites as they build Babel City and Babel Tower for that protection. Nimrod is very much an archetype type of figure for the Antichrist. Let's say an Antichrist wannabe, just as Antichrist likely will be have a pedigree from the giants. Now, Nimrod, he acted very much like a giant. So either the knowledge and the technology that he inherited to build from a fellow named Hermes, part of the Hermes Trismegistus Giftus, according to the Polychronicon of the secret societies and Gnosticism, Hermes brings this knowledge to Nimrod to build Babel Tower, and also brings the knowledge of the antediluvian religion, the mystical religion that I like to call Enochian mysticism. That's Enoch, son of Cain, not Enoch, son of Jared. There's two Enochs in biblical history and two different patriarchs. Somehow this knowledge allows him to become a mighty one, and he acts like a mighty one. Again, there's that hint of knowledge, not only to build the city, but extra knowledge that may have helped in his strength. And what he also does is he intermarries with the Mesopotamian giant bloodlines and starts to create bloodline dynasties that are a hybrid giant and human dynasty, or he intermarries with a fallen angel goddess to create more giants and a dynasty descended from him.
Let's get back to Babylon's beast system that you mentioned. Can you tell us some of the key features of the Babylonian beast system and how these features illustrate the control and influence of specific bloodlines in the end of days?
Beast system is going to have 10 kings that have the world, that are running the world. And so it's going to be like a replacement of the United Nations down to 10 bloodline kings. These bloodline kings, they come down through history as the royales. And biblically we get passages that talks about these ones. They're called the terrible ones who did terrible things to humankind. They're depicted in this crazy dual prophecy in Ezekiel 32, talking to the mighty ones that are already in the pit prison, slain terrible giants, and also the mighty El that are also in there. So you have giants actually in the prison, but along the cells, along the sides of the pit prison, and they're all talking to Pharaoh, another Rephaim, and that these are part of the Rephaim beast system of the bloodlines of the royales. In Psalms 21:8, we actually get prophesied that this bloodline is going to be eliminated in the time of God's anger, in the time of his wrath, where he's going to destroy their seed from among the children of men. Now, we also get a connection back to the bloodlines in Daniel 2 and the metallic empires, where you have these 10 kings, and they're partly of clay and partly of iron, and iron is the last empire. That's how we make one of those connections, that the end-time empire has this connection as the Roman Empire has its original root. The other dynasties that are listed, empires that are listed in the book of Daniel, is Babylon, the head of gold, then you have Persia, silver, and then you have the chest as bronze for Greece, and then you have the iron legs that were in two parts. Constantinople and Rome were the two parts. And then you have these 10 kings. So look for a separation on 5 kings on each toes that I think we're seeing starting to develop if we're in the fig tree generation, and I think we might be with the Eastern nations that include a lot of the BRIC nations, particularly India, China, Persia, Russia, and China.
Could you just very quickly explain what the fig tree generation is?
The fig tree generation is part of the signs that Jesus provided to the disciples, and it's an overarching sign where all of the events that he said would take place. There's a specific generation that's called the fig tree generation, and in prophetic allegory, the southern kingdom of Judah is the fig tree, just as Jesus destroyed the fig tree because it wasn't bearing any fruit before he went into his last days on this earth before being crucified. When you see that fig tree blooming, knowing that all of these events that he prophesied would take place, heaven and earth would pass away, but his words would never pass away. So it's part of the overarching sign, and there's a specific generation. We don't know how long a generation is. It could be 120 years, could be 70 years, or could be 40 years, and then we need to know when that starts. My speculation would be that if it started, the fig tree generation, it would have been the taking of Jerusalem in 1967 by the visible southern kingdom that we know as Jewish people today. And that it precedes the days of Noah, another reference to a generation that is going to be like that. And then the last 7 years of that generation is the last 7 years of this age where all things have to be fulfilled. And so what's interesting on Daniel 2:42 is that when it's talking about these 10 kings, that they're going to mingle themselves with the seed of men. That's a very bizarre statement. So it's either talking about the descendants of the giants that are going to intermingle with the seed of men, or there's going to be an introduction of giants again in the end time. And you could take that either way, but there's two different seed lines that are being talked about.
So you're talking about the potential for a third incursion of giants?
Yeah, I think we have to be open to that because, you could look at it from either somehow they were saved by fallen angels in sarcophagus or stasis in another dimension, in the earth, in Antarctica, however you would want to get there, or there's going to be another incursion. But if it's like the days of Noah, one would suggest that if the Watchers procreated giants before the flood, did so again after the flood, we're going to see that again. And we're going to see these Watchers, these fallen angels, walking amongst us as we get closer to the last 7 years as well. So expect giants in some form and Watchers.
Could a third inclusion somehow involve the modern-day alien abduction phenomenon, do you think, and this supposed alien-human hybrid program?
Yeah, I mean, you could imagine that, or you could also imagine the technology of DNA manipulation, just as I had started off in the first part of the show, that they had that level of technology that they could recreate giants through backwards engineering or through DNA manipulation, that they could add things into the genes to recreate the giants, or as they're traditionally were created. We have angels not in the pit prison that rebelled. And there's a lot of angels who rebelled. We look at Revelation 12, and it talks about a third of the angels that had rebelled. Also in Revelations in the book of Daniel, we get a number that could be allegorical, so it could be even larger than this, but it talks about 10,000 times 10,000 loyal angels, which is 100 million. A third of them rebelled. That means, depending on how you want to calculate that, 33 million or 50 million. And in other passages, the angels are uncountable. They're like the stars of the universe, so there could be even more. So there's a lot of angels that are invisible ones that are still running this world, along with the hierarchy of the visible ones. We could see a lot of giants being recreated because they know their time is short. Or, from a polytheist perspective, they're preparing for the new age or the new Atlantis.
Give us a crash course on who the Watchers were again.
So the Watchers in the book of Enoch are the sons of God who went to human females to create giants. And Watchers are recorded in Daniel 4, and it's the Hebrew word Ayir, meaning to watch. And the Watchers are four groups of angels that are at the highest part of the angelic hierarchy of the sacred rulers, as you take hierarchy back to Greek and Mount Olympus, and the Greek meaning is sacred rulers. They are the ones that are around the throne of God. So you have Ophanium, you have Cherubim, you have Seraphim, which are the serpent-faced angels, and you have archangels.
The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Gary, how do the bloodlines we've been talking about of the elites relate to the roles and actions of the Four Horsemen in biblical prophecy?
Yes, so the Four Horsemen show up in Revelation 6, and there's a companion Old Testament passage in Zechariah as well. They're pulling chariots, but they're acting in the same sort of manner. Both come from the throne of God. And this is the opening of the seals, which happens about at the time of the last 7 years, or the 7 years comes from Daniel 9:27, where you have this covenant that's being created and negotiated by a rising Antichrist. This is after the rise. The Four Horsemen will go out through the earth with their catastrophes, which are the same as in the birthing sorrows that Jesus provided. They get stronger, and they're going to deliver destruction to the earth of 25%. So that's 25% of the population, 25% of the water, 25% of everything is going to be destroyed in these catastrophes and wars. The rise of Babylon and the rise of the 10 kings are part of this Four Horsemen. And so what drives people into this empire, and that the empire is not going to be bringing peace, but all it does is bring more war, and yet there's more destruction yet to come. So 33% destruction in the trumpets, and the wrath bowls in the last year of the last 7 years in the year of the Lord's wrath would be 100%. So if we look at that model of this beast system that's being put in place, that is going to be very high tech. It's going to have quantum computing in it that can go interdimensionally. It's going to have AI at a level that we can't even imagine at this point. It's going to have some sort of cryptocurrency that fits into it. It's a convergence of technology and a convergence of these 10 kings and a convergence of Babylon that is going to shape the last 7 to 10 years of this age, and that the bloodlines are going to be subservient to this mystical religion, even though they are running 10 groups of countries around the world. They will still be subservient to the mystical religion, just as the mystical religion was dominant over the thrones in the beast empires. It's that history that's sort of repeating itself. So the four riders on the horses aren't related to the bloodlines. They're just depicting what there is being permitted to happen as we get closer to the end of the age. And so they go and ride out through the earth and permit all of these calamities to take place.
Are there modern bloodlines instrumental in unfolding the events of the Great Tribulation?
Oh, absolutely. And so we hear in Revelation 6, for example, of the great men and the kings of the earth, and we have them around in the Revelation battle and at the Joel 1 and 2 or Revelation 9, Ezekiel 38 and 39 battle. And these words that are talking about these great men and these kings, two words sort of stand out for me. One is mega, and one is megastanes, and both of them are Greek words as they're used to translate into our language, and they're rooted in giant imagery and understanding. So, mega is like a large, huge, and a chief, weighty, stout, wide, large, old. Megastani has similar sort of meaning. So when it's talking about these beings, these are the Greek cognate words for the bloodlines that are being talked about for the mighty ones in the Old Testament. And the mighty ones as in describing the giants. So we're either going to see bloodline individuals running these 10 kings and empires, or we're going to have new giants created. And one sort of example is how we start to see some of these things rising. We have China that is flexing their muscles and looking to take Taiwan. They've already got Hong Kong. They'll probably be looking at more. Imagine that as they expand an empire of China, and you have President Xi, and that's spelled Xi, and he is a bloodline descendant out of the Shah dynasty, XIA, that produced two bloodline sets of kings, a Western bloodline and an Eastern bloodline that were created by the dragon creator gods. And so you have a bloodline dictator in charge of China that looks to be forming one of these empires. We're not there yet. There's lots to be played out, and there's going to be lots of wars and geopolitical wrangling of empires, and particularly as the Chinese and the Russians and other bloodlines start to surface again, push back against the European bloodlines who are trying to insert their will on the world, and that's why you have opposing views on what this New World Order, as I like to call it, the Nephilim World Order, or the Nephilim World Order for the fallen ones, that they're trying to put together. So, leaders like Putin and Xi and Trump to a certain extent said, no, we don't accept the European model. We want a larger role for the U.S. The Russians are saying they want a larger role. Xi is saying he wants a larger role. If we want to really understand the world of what's going on today, we have to understand that you have to get behind what the media tells us. And what's motivating these bloodlines is dominance. And they're going to want to raise their bloodline to a level that they'll be the one that's going to create this dynasty moving into the New Age, because there could only be one dragon messiah. There can only be one antichrist as we would know them out of Christian prophecy, and the other ones will be part of the nobility elite, but they won't be ruling over this 1,000-year reign that they've been promising.
How is the Antichrist's bloodline linked to historical empires? What that implies for his role in the end times?
Yeah, so in Daniel 8, we get this passage about these 7 empires again, a little bit different format, and it works perfectly with Daniel 7. But it does focus in on the Greek and the Persian Empire, and that in the latter days of this Greek Empire, and understanding that the Greek Empire was split into 4 empires after Alexander died. This was the imagery of Alexander that's being described and described as the leader of the Greeks at that time when he overthrows Persia, which was Alexander. Rome comes out of that empire, which follows the Greek Empire. So what it's saying is expect this Antichrist figure to eventually rise out of the Roman Empire and the Greek Empire, which are essentially about the same geography, but it's a lot of different countries. But there's a lot of bloodlines that are rivals to make this happen. And we're going to see multiple Antichrist-like figures as this all heats up. So much so that Antichrist will need somebody that the whole world thinks is the Antichrist to prove his credentials. As Jesus defeats Antichrist at Armageddon, the true Antichrist will have to have another Antichrist, another Armageddon-like battle to deceive the world that he is the promised one. So look for bloodlines to put forward rivals who have a pedigree, and they take their genealogies all the way back into prehistory, all the way back to a patriarchal Nephilim or Rephaim and or both, and also back to a specific fallen angel that I kind of have coined a term kind of tongue-in-cheek that I would call the celestial mafia godfathers. They take their genealogy back to a specific angel as well, and all of that genealogy is expressed in the taciturn language of their coat of arms.
What are the elect? In the time of Jacob's trouble, there's the elect.
The time of Jacob's trouble is out of the Old Testament in the book of Micah, and that's the Hebrew word trouble for Sarah, and it is a tribulation. And so that's referring to Israel. It means the same thing as chosen, but you also get the elect that are talked about in the time of the Great Tribulation in the last 3.5 years as well. Those not taken away in what Christians would understand as a rapture. And those left will have to experience the Great Tribulation not seen since creation. So even though there's going to be tribulation before, this is a whole different level of tribulation that happens in the end time. So you have 2 groups of elect, just as Paul talks about the Christians being grafted into the Holy Covenant, and that Israel has had a temporary hardening of the heart, but that Christians do not replace Israel. And when I talk about Israel, separate them into two parts: the visible southern kingdom, that would be the Jewish people today, and the lost tribes. And so the lost tribes are going to awaken in the last 7 years, likely through the 144,000 who are going to go out throughout the world to awaken them. And then they're going to be persecuted and put in prisons until Jesus comes along after the rapture and before Armageddon, and likely in the year of the Lord's favor, to bust them out as the breaker, as he's described, to lead them in the great second Exodus back to the wilderness, along with visible, what I call visible Judah versus lost Israel, that are dispersed around the world that we understand as the Jewish people. And they'll meet up with the people who, in Israel today, will flee Jerusalem after Antichrist crowns himself as the king of Jerusalem. At the abomination at the midpoint of the last 7 years, they'll flee to the wilderness, and a couple of years later, Jesus will lead the rest of Israel there to be judged and brought back into the covenant in time for Armageddon. And so the elect are both the Christians, and Christians are called elect in the New Testament. So when the elect are taken to heaven in Jesus' oratory, that's the new church, and the elect in the Old Covenant is Israel and Judah, and they have a reconciliation that's different than the church, and it's important to separate that.
There's also something called the Tribulation of the Saints. What is that all about?
Tribulation of the Saints is the Greek word thlipsis, and it means tribulation, affliction, things like that. So Christians are going to go through tribulation, and in Revelation 3 we're told there's going to be 10 years of tribulation. So there is the tribulation of the saints that are going to testify for Jesus and God in the last 10 years, and specifically the first 3.5 years of the last 7. And they're going to be persecuted and slaughtered as martyrs for their testimony, and they'll be testifying against Babylon. This is called the Tribulation of the Saints in Revelation 7, the same word that's used for affliction in Jesus' account in Matthew 24. And some people say, well, you can't equate affliction with tribulation. There are two different meanings. It's the same Greek word. You can have multiple meanings. And it's a different tribulation than the tribulation in the last 3.5 years. So one is the tribulation of the world not seen since creation. The other one is the tribulation of the saints. So when you look at the parallel passage of Matthew 24:21 of the tribulation not seen since the beginning of the world, in Mark 13:19, it's not called tribulation, it's called affliction. It's the same word. It's the Greek word thlipsis, and it's cognate to the same time frame as Sarah for the time of Jacob's trouble, and the time of trouble that's in Daniel 12. So we have to apply the... I wish the translations were a little bit more consistent. It would help a lot for Christians. So understand there's a tribulation of the world and a tribulation of the saints. So there's going to be tribulations that Christians go through. They're promised two things. One, to be saved from the hour of trial and temptation, as we're told in the book of Revelation, and one from the year of the Lord's wrath. And that hour of temptation is the timing of the rise of Antichrist and the hour that the 10 kings hand their power over to Antichrist to destroy Babylon. And Antichrist will set up his own new religion and his own beast system as a beast and as the eighth beast empire. And that this is the hour that Babylon is destroyed, is described in the summary of the last 3.5 years in Revelation 14 about verse 8 going forward, and the hour of destruction as the details in Revelation 18, and the hour when there are multiple antichrists in the last time, and that should be translated probably as the last hour as well. And it's the same hour that Jesus is coming back, and that's what we're promised to be delivered from, is that hour of temptation, which is the mark of the beast.
Ken Goodsword is a systems analyst with expertise in industrial robotics, software engineering, and data design. He's a smart cookie. He enjoys applying these skills to ancient Hebrew and Sumerian documents and the UFO phenomenon. Ken is also the lead translator for the groundbreaking Bara Bible, which offers a fresh perspective on the original ancient Hebrew text through in-depth etymological analysis. Anyway, he's really smart, and we're going to bring him on right now. Nice to meet you, Ken. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks, Rich. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
Explain the close encounters of the first, second, and third kind, so we have a little baseline, so how they would show up in the Bible.
Remember Project Blue Book? The scientist who created this kind of classification system of the first, second, and third kind, he was the lead of Project Blue Book, which was a U.S. Army initiative, and their primary job was at first to investigate whether there was any kind of credibility towards the UFO phenomenon. This was launched pretty much right after the Roswell incident. Essentially went on for decades, but they changed their names a few times and sometimes said that the program had been shut down, but it's probably still active today under a different name. At any rate, the scientific approach was that they wanted to look at what the different kinds of data that were involved in various types of sightings. So basically just trying to kind of categorize and be able to sort through some of this. There's so much wild data that it's like, if you just start reading stories, you're like, okay, well, that's interesting, but what do we do with that? So part of the idea was to break it down and categorize it. So first of all, there was the differentiation between close encounters and, let's say, far encounters. I'm not sure what they actually called it, but basically, hey, there's a light in the sky over there. It looks weird. I don't know what it is, but it's hard to see much else because it's presumably far away. Versus these, what they consider to be close encounters, which is an object that seems to be, say, 500 feet away or closer. That's the concept of the close encounter. Then the different kinds has to do with what types of elements come about during the encounter. So if there are any traces of physical evidence left behind, like such as broken tree branches or crop circles or any other kind of physical evidence that was left behind, that becomes a second kind. If there isn't any of that, it's first of all considered to be a first kind. Second kind is with additional evidence. Third kind is when there's actually living entities or, let's say, extraterrestrial beings present, and whether they're in a craft or coming out of a craft. And the fourth kind is when there's actual contact involved.
When you're writing this, I feel like if I was listening, I would think, well, I've read the Bible. I don't remember anybody talking about ET, but you have so many examples. But what's the criteria that you use for it to kind of make that writing for you to go like, okay, they could be talking about this?
A lot of times there's contextual information that is given within the narrative, but tends to be glossed over or, I'll say, mistranslated, because honestly, it does seem to be like sometimes it seems like it's intentionally mistranslated, or it could just be that somebody originally way back, this was kind of the idea that we had, and then it's sort of nobody's really questioning that, and we keep using the same translations. When you dig into a lot of the narratives that are written, these are generally written in ancient Greek or ancient Hebrew. My field of study focuses more on the Hebrew side of things, so that's basically encompasses the Old Testament of the Bible. We have authors such as Moses and Ezekiel and Jeremiah and all these other prophets, King David, King Solomon. All these guys are credited as writing portions of the Bible. And all of them, they're telling their story. They have possibly different agendas or different storytelling styles, or maybe they're even, you could consider them different genres. But in all of these cases, we also see what appears to be some kind of UFO encounter narrative. There are a lot of similarities across these different narratives, and what we typically see is that there's an object that is in the sky, and it's described as being metallic. A lot of times they'll use terms like brass or bronze or gold, and it's often described as being shining or having lights on it, and is often very noisy. There's sometimes clouds involved, which could be smoke or some kind of condensation from the atmosphere. And these are all elements that also pop up outside of the Bible in the UFO record in general. So there's this long history of UFO encounters, a lot of documented cases. It's not always clear whether you should even believe some of them. I mean, some of them seem really crazy, but some of them have got to be true, or at least oftentimes people are trying to describe something that happened to them. There is this real consistency across the phenomenology of ufology.
Across all history, right? It's not just in the Bible. It's probably in every single faith and every history. There's something that people were seeing something, whether the faraway encounter of a light in the sky or some kind of experience that maybe they didn't have the words for or the language for or the descriptive ability to say, well, yeah, it was a wheel within a wheel. Right, but they're seeing something and not just in the Bible. And I guess that makes me wonder what lit that up for you.
Well, first of all, I guess I'll say I come from a Christian background. I'm very heavily involved in church leadership. I was a deacon for several years. I played on a worship band for probably close to 30 years and was involved in a lot of different kinds of ministry. So to me, the Bible's always been a very important part of my life, and I always wanted to try to understand it. So at some point, I began to think that there was some kind of disconnect between the way that we typically are understanding it and the way that the Bible is being interpreted and explained at church or, in kind of the mainstream Christianity versus some of the other weirder parts. So I had already written a book about magic in the Bible because I had noticed some areas where doctrinally I was seeing a mismatch between what we're taught about, let's say Moses, for example. So Moses talks about certain things about magic, and the way that we talk about what Moses was saying didn't seem to me to match up to what Moses was actually saying. So that was kind of interesting that it kind of got me thinking that, well, we don't really know what these guys were really thinking. It's in a different language. It's in a very different culture. Some of these stories are about 3,000 years old, or probably even older, but were possibly written down around 3,000 years ago. Maybe not all. Some of them are a little bit newer, but they're old. Yeah, like in terms of just trying to sort out like my thoughts around some of these ideas. And I've always been a really big fan of shows like Ancient Aliens and, kind of reading some of the literature like Eric Van Daniken and stuff like that. And these guys, they would mention kind of almost just in passing, you mentioned the wheels within wheels from Ezekiel 1, and this is something that gets brought up quite often. But to me, nobody was really going into the detail that I wanted.
It does seem like a brush over when you hear that. You're like, and so I guess now you bring up something else as you kind of get going on this. Growing up in a Christian atmosphere and being a minister, do people look at you? I use the word perverse. Do they look at you and say, hey, that's sacrilegious. That's not what the Bible says. And you're like, well, hold on a minute.
Well, I'm very much aware of that. Like, I get it. I totally understand why somebody might say that. In fact, I would have said it myself 10 years ago or whatever. I'm actually really been amazed that I haven't really received very much blowback, like even from people that I know who I was like, I don't want to let them know that I'm doing this, but it's been quite well received. And maybe also people don't necessarily want to talk about it if they don't agree, and that's fine too. But also, I'm not trying to be pushy about it either. So I'm like, hey, here's my book. I'm not really going to tell you what it's about. I mean, I will on this show, obviously. Well, let's just say Genesis 1, then, first verse in the Bible, where we think it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. As I've been digging into the Hebrew text and learning the ancient Hebrew language, I'm realizing that the way that we interpret ancient Hebrew is completely way off. So, for example, in that first verse, you have, I think, 7 words. Bereshit, bara, Elohim. There's a few more words. I can't remember them off the top of my head. Basically, though, it doesn't say in the beginning. It doesn't say God. It doesn't say created. It doesn't say the heavens. And the only word that's correct in our translations is earth. The starting point, the first sentence in the Bible, is talking about a story that happens on Earth, which is a weird thing to say when you're starting out your story. You don't usually say once upon a time on Earth.
Okay, so then you move into the part of Genesis. Who would see it first? Moses, maybe?
In that first verse, it's identifying two groups of people that are not humans. The Elohim, the other one is the Shemim, and this is something that I don't think anyone has uncovered. I'm Googling stuff, and I'm like, nobody's talking about the Shemim. So that's sort of this other project that I'm doing about the Bara Bible. So basically that first verse is already talking about two groups of aliens. Definitely Moses is a huge ET story. We don't really know what the Elohim means or who they are or whatever, but we do know that it's a group of people because the suffix im indicates that it's a plural and that it's some kind of intelligent life form. The im only is used for people groups, and animals. So we know it's some kind of animal or humanoid.
You said everybody from Ezekiel to Moses, Daniel, even David, Samuel, they all have these UFO encounters. As we get going into it, why do you think those things are left in the Bible? Why do you think it didn't get edited out? Why do you think it's so prevalent when you start researching it, that this is more than just a vision, that this is an actual encounter of the third kind or even the second or first kind?
I think it would be impossible to edit it out completely because there wouldn't really be much of a story left. It's literally just so baked in to the narrative. And even look at the book of Psalms, okay? It's a songbook, basically. Most of those songs, I haven't actually done the math on this, but there's a lot of the Psalms that mention flying chariots, them coming down and shooting the enemies with what sounds like laser beams. It's such a huge concept to the people who wrote the text. It's critical to them. And so it's all part of them telling their story. Also, like I said, back to the beginning of the book of Genesis, like it comes right off the top. It's like, this is a book about UFOs. This is a book about extraterrestrials who came to Earth and then got into some crazy stories.
Let's convince people. Let's say that I've read the Bible and I haven't seen any evidence of UFOs in the Bible. So beyond Genesis, once we get into what's a big ticket, like maybe Jacob wrestling the angel or Moses, what would you convince me?
Jacob's a good one. Jacob's a really good example because it's not very well hidden. The story of Jacob's ladder, we all know the story, and it's obvious that the way they explain it is it's pretty much right there. There's very little whitewashing done. It's just this extra layer of interpretation laid over top of it. But in the story of Jacob's ladder, which occurs in the book of Genesis, later in the book, Jacob is traveling to go visit his brother or his cousin or somebody, and he, along the way, he actually sees what he describes as a camp of strange beings. So he describes them as like, these guys are not from around here. He's sort of like watching like across the canyon to where they are. And so he decides they're going to stop here for the night. And they stick around there because he's probably interested to find out what the heck's going on. And it's actually the next night when he has this encounter where something comes down from the sky. He describes it as though there's a ladder, or like he says that there's entities going up and down. Well, he doesn't use the word angel because angel is a Greek word. So that word didn't exist.
From what I understood from the Bible, and so correct me here. So my version that I remember is there's a stairway that looks like it's going up into the clouds, and there's angels moving up and down. And so
yeah, right.
Is that the common belief?
Basically, and that's essentially true. The word isn't angel. The word is literally means worker. So it could be an employee, or sometimes it's a messenger. The word angel doesn't exist for hundreds of years later because this is a Hebrew story. This goes back before the Greek translation. And the Hebrew words describe it as, yeah, it's a staircase, but actually more accurate to say that it was a ramp, which is kind of interesting to me. So basically he says, look, there's something up in the sky, and it seems to be there's some bright light involved, and there's a ramp with beings coming up and down from this object in the sky down to Earth. And he confronts one of these guys, and they get into a wrestling match. So classically, the story is that this angel, we usually interpret it as an angel, that he wrestled with Jacob, but why would an angel do that? So for whatever reason, this entity and Jacob get into some kind of match here, and basically Jacob is described as having a limp for the rest of his life. So that's why that story is the second kind, because there's physical evidence left behind. In the typical Catholic understanding of an angel as being a spiritual being, how does that work? Why do spiritual beings need to walk up and down a ramp in the first place? Why are they able to have a wrestling match with somebody and leave physical damage? This whole idea of like this Platonic idea where there's like physical reality and a spiritual reality is not supported in this story whatsoever. These are physical things happening to physical people, happening with other physical, non-human beings.
Now let's get into Moses a little bit.
Yeah.
Seems like that story has a lot going on as far as things that may be at least more than supernatural.
Let's start with the beginning of Moses' story where he sees a burning bush. He was minding his own business as a shepherd out in the wilderness when all of a sudden he sees this supposedly what we call a burning bush. Problem is, in the original Hebrew language, they don't use the word bush. So there's this other word that is kind of pulled out of nowhere. We call it hapax legomena, where there's a word that only appears once in the text. So because of that, there's really no way to compare it to other contexts to determine what might it mean. So we either know what it means or we don't. And in this case, we don't. It's not a bush, and there's other words in Hebrew that do mean bush. There's plenty of other words that they could have used if they were trying to describe a bush.
What makes that UFO-y? Could that just not be God appearing through a burning rock or something else? I mean, what makes that extraterrestrial?
This is the thing, is part of this is etymological sort of investigation as to like, well, we think we know what it means, but we don't really know what it means. And, we don't really know what's going on here. I'm not actually really even trying to say, hey, guys, this is a UFO. What I'm trying to say is, guys, what we think we know, we don't know. I do get into it, and there's a lot of stuff here around fire and light and flames and a voice that comes from it. So it's this weird story. Like, I don't know what that is, but it kind of sounds like other UFO encounters that I've read about, where there's a ship. In this particular example, we don't necessarily see a description of a ship, but what we do see is these other effects that are happening. When you look at the phenomenon of ufology in general, you see these patterns, and whether it's the shape of the object or the lights or whatever else that's happening, there's all these things that come into play. So when I see 3 or 4 of these things line up, even though there's a lot of other pieces that aren't there, it makes you wonder.
You talk a little bit about Moses. A lot of the images that you talk about, you're like, that's interesting, is the fire in the sky, which seemed to follow Moses through the desert the entire time they were wandering in the desert. Tell us a little bit more about that.
There's a famous UFO encounter that happened in the United States in the year 1847, I believe it was, where a flying craft was witnessed by hundreds of Americans, farmers, townspeople, the mayors of cities, and a lot of people from California. It actually kind of went up into Canada and then down through the Midwest and ended in Texas, where the ship actually crashed, and the people basically had a funeral and buried one of the corpses of these extraterrestrials that were in the craft. The reason I bring this up is that was a 6-month period where hundreds of people saw this same ship. And it is often assumed that, well, that's like the longest UFO sighting in history. But it's not, because Moses's went on for 40 years and was seen by thousands of people on a daily basis every day, and the thing never left. And the way that they describe it does have all the qualities. It's ticking all the boxes for what a UFO usually looks and sounds like and is described as in any UFO encounter. It's metallic, it's fiery, it's loud, it's noisy, it's dangerous. You're not allowed to go near it. It flies. And in this particular case, it seems to be looking for something in the desert. And so Moses and his crew, which is the entire country, we don't know exactly how many people there were, Some theologians have estimated it was possibly 5 million people wandering in the desert with Moses. So this huge group of people, and they all are witnessing this flying object. They see it come down on top of Mount Sinai. Moses goes to check it out. He says, hey, you guys stay down here. It's obviously dangerous. By the end of about a week or two of the first contact, there were actually over 70 different Hebrew leaders went up Mount Sinai to check this thing out and had close encounters. And then this ship, or possibly like a spin-off or a portion or like a sub-craft or whatever, I don't know how this thing works, but this is now described as, okay, well, it's going to stay here and you guys are going to follow it. And this continued for 40 years until they got to the land of Canaan. Then the craft finally left, but here's what a really strange thing is, that as it's leaving, the Elohim, who is identified as a guy named Yahweh, tells Moses and the people, okay, you guys stay here. I'm going to go across the river. My craft, he actually calls it the Hornet. I'm going to send the Hornet out in front of you. It's going to weaken the inhabitants of the land so that when you guys come across, you'll be able to just wipe them out and they're not going to put up a fight. What? That is the craziest story.
When you put it that way, it almost doesn't seem like it could be anything else.
Yeah. So maybe there's no literal metal ship, but then, okay, so it's definitely Yahweh. That's what they call him in the story. And he's talking to them, and he's telling them what he's going to do, and he does it. So if it's not a spacecraft, then who the heck is this Yahweh guy, and why is he acting so weird? I think that the Star of Bethlehem doesn't qualify as a close encounter because it's basically a point of light in the sky that's pretty far away. But it definitely moves like a manned craft. I mean, it could have been remote control, but it does not move like any kind of known celestial object, be that a comet, a meteor, another planet, or any kind of star or anything like that. It was definitely not a star. I think you can definitely rule out any of those other possibilities because they don't stop. If they do stop, it's because they crash onto the Earth with a fair amount of damage to whatever they land on. You're not going to see a comet that's going to stop, that's going to lead you somebody for several months from a distant land and then suddenly point at a specific house or a barn or whatever and say, hey, look, this is your location. Like, it just doesn't work.
Jason Martell, one of the leading researchers and lecturers in ancient civilization technologies.
You know, the research has been something that's ongoing for probably 2 or 3 decades now, looking into the ancient cultures, trying to understand the big question of where we come from. There's such a large amount of evidence that we've uncovered in the past. Up till now, it's been very difficult and arduous to look through those archives, to look through those artifacts. The game is changing. We have ways to do things much faster and find the needle in the haystack quicker.
And when we say ancient astronauts, Jason, who are we talking about?
That's a broad topic that covers the idea that, you know, as we look across cultures, over 30 of the top ancient cultures around the world, they all seem to reference a time when they interacted or lived amongst what they considered to be living gods. So when we look at the term ancient astronaut theory, what we're doing is identifying artifacts and information coming out of ancient cultures where they speak of interactions with their living gods. To give you an example, in our modern Bible, King James New American Version, considering we have the Old Testament and previous versions, we have stories that talk about man interacting with their living gods. And so it's very possible that through the ancient astronaut theory, we look at these as physical events, not mythology, things that actually took place in the past. And so that's what we use the ancient astronaut theory of the umbrella of research, is to analyze the past. Were some of these interactions actual physical events that took place?
Where do you think they came from, Jason?
You know, when we look at the evidence, George, one of the things that seems to pop up and really just brings about more questions is, where did some of these gods come from? Where are they originating? And one of the things that I've picked up on is there seems to be a theme with like a watery planet of these homeworlds of the gods. We look to several different races, tribes, and cultures around the globe that reference their gods and give visuals and do rituals. And surprisingly, a lot of these cultures reference a type of being that seems to show up in a large suit that looks very similar to the late 1800, early 1900 divers, that we would send to the deep parts of our ocean. Those big oversized suits that allow you to do pressurized dives. What we see is a lot of these depictions of these gods from various cultures in South America, Peru, all the way to the other side in like Africa, with the Dogon tribe. There seems to be a connection with this term of Dagu and Dogon. The Dogon tribe were actually referencing something called the Dog Star, Sirius A and B. And the whole idea of, when we talk about dragons, this whole denotation of that dragon, Dog Star, Dagu, Dogon, all of these references somehow, George, are referencing some type of a watery god, some god that either shows up in the water or is comfortable in the water or has a sign like the Sumerian god of Enki that is symbolized of bringing the water bearer, but definitely a water-bearing planet, something very similar to Earth. We see commonalities of signs of evidence from where these gods originate from. Most of our planet is covered by water, and there's probably some connection there that these beings come to our planet and also have some type of a connection with a planet similar to the terrain that we currently occupy.
Is there any evidence, Jason, that shows where the ancient astronauts came here and how they came here?
There's evidence that we're still trying to put together, right? So I'll give you an example. When we look at a lot of these sites around the world, there are places that have very, very large platforms that have been built. We don't understand why, and they're around the globe. One of these is at Baalbek in Lebanon. There are trilithiton stones, huge, huge blocks that have been stacked to make these large platforms. And then ensuing cultures have built their civilization on top of these platforms. But the original purpose of some of these platforms, like Baalbek in Lebanon, there's actually references of King Gilgamesh, ancient Sumerian tales, and other cultures that reference seeing large smoke and fire as they hear the gods descending or ascending from these locations, like Baalbek in Lebanon. There's actual quotes of King Gilgamesh seeing the gods at these locations as they're ascending and hearing all that loud sounds of fire and smoke. Sounds like a rocket ship landing. And when we look at other sites, George, like Teotihuacan and other sites like that in Mexico, there's these huge platforms and steps leading up to the platform. We have to wonder what they were used for. Could they have just been some ritual ceremony? Or could they have been actual landing pads for some type of spacecraft that visited ancient cultures in the past?
Jason, you've seen the carvings on the sarcophagus lid of Lord Pakal, haven't you?
One of the most infamous carvings that, again, brings to question some of the information that we get visually from these artifacts. Anyone who spends time analyzing the lid of Pakal can clearly see that he's positioned in such a way that looks just like our modern-day astronauts manipulating a rocket ship. He has his hands on what appear to be some type of levers. His nose looks like it's connected to a breathing apparatus. And what's really the shocker, George, is you can see that there seems to be some type of flames or combustion coming out of the bottom of his capsule. So when we look at the sarcophagus lid, one, it's buried underneath a pyramid. They literally built a pyramid on top of his tomb, so there's no way that this large sarcophagus lid could have been placed there easily. It's a very intricate design. But clearly, the visual of that shows that King Pakal was some type of an astronaut or was some type of a space-bearing person. If you look at the physical evidence of that depiction, he's clearly manipulating what appears to be some type of a rocket ship.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like he clearly came down to Earth from someplace.
Exactly. They're depicting things that we can look at the history of the objects and understand that they're thousands of years old. But when you compare them to modern technology and you see these similarities, it definitely raises questions.
What's your latest on your work with NASA and Mars?
It's an ongoing topic, George, and this is one of those areas where the AI helps. For years, myself included, I looked through NASA archives, Mail-in Space Science Systems, Jet Propulsion Laboratories, Goddard Space Center, many of these conglomerate organizations of NASA that have archives publicly available that we would sift through to look for artifacts, right? So Mars Global Surveyor, still active, still taking pictures. A lot of the cameras that we have orbiting Mars today come from a company called Malin Space Science Systems. They're located in San Diego. I have a long history with Dr. Mike Malin as a college student over 20 years ago. I would contact Dr. Mike Malin asking about the face of the pyramids on Mars. Is there anything that's artificial there? And it was always the same response. No, these are all natural sand and weather eroded objects. Now, instead of using manual looking at images, we use AI. Before, I would have to maybe spend the day looking at 100 images, 200 images, and now I can take AI and have it look at 250,000 images in one day.
And it even interprets for you, doesn't it?
It can, So, Vincent DiPietro, Greg Molinar, two famous researchers that went through the NASA archives and literally discovered the D&M pyramid found on Mars was located by these two gentlemen. They're like, my gosh, this is clearly a pyramidal complex, and then circulated. But it went through hours of looking for artifacts. With AI, right, I can just say, look for an object that looks like this, a pyramid, a four-sided, a five-sided. And the AI can look at thousands of images and just pull the ones that have these details for me. From that side, George, right, things have gotten a lot more exciting in that to find the needle in the haystack doesn't require hours of my manual time.
What's the target date to send an astronaut to the Mars?
Boy, it's right around the corner, George. Following SpaceX, we're targeted for 2026, just 2 years away. There's going to be plans to go to Mars as well as the Moon. And I know some of the missions to Mars are well underway as far as planning. So whether they keep that timeline of 2026, there's contracts in place with NASA that have to be fulfilled, obligated. But everything seems to be on track, and SpaceX has been making all kinds of innovations with spacesuits. As you've seen, maybe they're reusable rockets. So they're definitely the best candidates to be pioneering this race into space and get us to Mars. It seems like our whole life we've been talking about this, George, and now we're actually going to go there. So this is really going to change the game to have foot to dirt on the planet Mars. If we set foot on Mars and actually, investigate Cydonia and a lot of these sites firsthand, that's going to change the game.
I used to tell Richard C. Hoagland we had a theme. You won't know unless you go.
I love it. That's it. We should put that on a bumper sticker for one of the spaceships.
Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
Sending even probes and drones and such to do excavations and archaeological research is great. But the first time someone is there with their hands and dusts off a human skull and picks that up on the surface of Mars, that changes how we feel about where we come from.
Do you think that could happen?
I think it's definitely going to happen, George. I mean, when we look at the connection between Mars and Earth, Cydonia and Egypt, pyramids and a sphinx-like structure in Egypt, and literally pyramids and a sphinx-like face on Mars, there has to be a connection. There has to be some type of lost connection with Mars that we're still trying to understand. And most likely, we had a presence on Mars simultaneously with being on Earth, but this was probably thousands, if not, 1 million plus years ago.
When do we go back to the Moon, Jason? That's soon, too, isn't it?
It's on the radar. The question there, George, too, is why haven't we gone back? I joke about this to say, like Intel, the computer company, when they invented the Pentium chip, it's not like we've done it. We've made the Pentium. And I think the first one was like 50 megahertz. Now they're like 4,000 megahertz. But point is, when they invented the Pentium, it's not like they stopped. When we went to the Moon, it's not like we stopped. It's just not possible. So when will we go back publicly? I think is the answer, is the question. We can see that a lot of other countries are making inroads, especially China, publicly saying that they're looking to set up a base on the dark side of the Moon. For us, George, right, that raises a lot of questions because the dark side of the Moon contains a presence that has made it very clear that it doesn't want us there. So the Moon, just as well as Mars, I think invites interesting answers into our field of research to question, are we alone? Because clearly there's been a presence on the Moon. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, even then, they made comments on the off channel about what they're seeing there, and they were clearly not alone.
There's a 24,000-year cycle known as Procession. What does that mean?
Procession is a technical term today that we use to basically monitor the movements of the heavens. Everyone's heard of the 12 houses of the zodiac, where we've essentially divided the heavens into 12 parts, each one being a constellation. Well, it turns out that the ancients somehow measured time using this system called Procession, and they were aware of a 24,000-year cycle. So for us, that comes down to understanding that every 2,000 years, we essentially point to a new North Star. So there's a degradation in our orbits that says there's something causing precession. Now, the modern term says it's caused by anomalies with our moon, and that basically every 72 years we degrade by 1 degree. It's a very complicated set of math. There's been a lot of new research to question this precession and say that there's probably a much more elegant and complicated reason for why we have precession. And that simple answer, George, is possibly because we have 2 suns, not just one. And that changes the equation of our solar system dynamics. Sometimes it's hard for just our brain to realize that we might be a solar system that has not just 1 sun, but 2. It's a binary star system. I mean, most of the star systems that we filmed externally with Hubble and various other telescopes, we see that most systems are binary, or more than that, have an intricate dance of various stars going around each other. Sirius A and B would be a good example. So it's very possible that we have a second sun, but it's either now a brown dwarf or it's another star system that we haven't identified, maybe Sirius A and B. But there's strong evidence to suggest that binary solar systems are of the commonality, are the norm. And so if we were a binary star system, this changes the aspect of how we look at the solar system from a simple way. If you picture in your brain right now, solar system, you see a picture of the sun sitting there stagnant, it's not moving, and all the little planets are circling the Earth and their intricacies in their orbits. Binary means that our sun is moving through space around another object, another star system. If you can think about that, 2 suns in this dance, that means our planet and all the other little planets going around the sun, we are moving through space as well. And so if you think about a moving solar system, 2 suns in orbit, that means all the planets around those stars, around our sun, are also moving through space. So it's a hard mental shift. This is something I show in my lecture at Contact in the Desert, is visualizing the movement of 2 solar systems. If we're moving through space, that's what's changing our dynamic every 24,000 years of this shift of why we see a different view of our solar system from Earth, is because we're literally moving through space. So that's another topic on precession. Many ancient cultures track this 24,000-year cycle. How did they do that? How were they even aware of a 24,000-year cycle? It's pretty amazing.
How far back do you think the cycle of time and ETs go on this planet?
George, I would say that there's probably a whole lost record of time that we can't account for in the current history books. Let me answer it another way to hopefully empower some of the listeners with a skill set to try and answer this for themselves. When we look at a lot of the sites around the world today, you can do this on Google Maps, you can see that there's a geological change that can be tracked. I'll give you an example. When we look at Egypt on Google Maps today, you can see that the Nile is many miles away from the foot of the 3 pyramids. It's geologically meandered miles away from where it originally was set. So if you look at the time of the pharaohs and even the first dynastic pharaohs and some of these things that they talk about coming down from the pyramids, going right to the Nile, being able to board it, and have access to the Nile right next to the pyramids. Now, that's not the case today. We can see again that it's moved several miles. So geologically, we can track how many thousands of years has it taken for that to take place. Now, we look at other sites. If you look again on Google Maps at, let's say, Machu Picchu or Cusco, any of those types of areas there in the Lake Titicaca area, what you see on Google Maps is that Lake Titicaca is very small. The waters have receded, 80%. And we see Cusco and Machu Picchu way up in the mountains on the edge of this ancient Lake Titicaca. Again, it shows that some of these sites are always built next to waterways. But Machu Picchu, Cusco, again, you can see that it's probably thousands of years for it to be able to shrink down to where it is now at the size of Lake Titicaca. So I would point out that there's sometimes geological changes that we can clearly see and note. Last one I would say with Egypt is look at the surrounding walls of the Sphinx. The surrounding walls of the inner part of these structures, have been inundated by water. Massive water has run over the surfaces of these walls. Last time water was falling to that degree in Egypt, 10,000 years. So, again, the geological evidence can sometimes pinpoint or speak over some of the known facts to say that, okay, if the pyramids, if they were built in 2500 BC, why do they have erosion and artifacts that show that they're much older, 10,000 years plus? Those are some of the lines of evidence, George, that we use, astronomical, geological, to try and pinpoint some of the actual dates of just how far back we go.
There's a book called Hamlet's Mill. You've looked at this. Tell us about it.
Hamlet's Mill is a really interesting piece of evidence because it's written by a couple of professionals that, looked at over 30 ancient cultures and realized that there's a commonality in how they describe this understanding of the 12 houses of the zodiac. Each symbol in our constellation has a reference to, like the scorpion, the bull, Aquarius, various different symbols that we use for these constellations. And in the book Hamlet's Mill, they discovered that over 30 ancient cultures used these astronomical symbols as a guide to kind of understand where they were in this cycle of time. Were they going into another dark age? Were they coming out of a dark age and headed towards a new golden age? These are all terms we've heard before, the golden age, the dark age. But it turns out that these are cyclical, not linear. The last time this really got on the radar, Procession and such, was in 2012 when the Mayan calendar reached a point to say that the calendar is now going to reset. And that was the time of basically us changing from the time of Pisces into the age of Aquarius. And there was literally a constellation change where our North Star was now pointing more towards the Aquarius constellation. So a lot of that evidence is just really interesting to look at how it affects us and to be aware that there were over 30 ancient cultures that used these references to kind of understand this larger question of where we were in the cycle of time, and that they actually had knowledge and were aware of this process of going into a dark age and coming out of a dark age and going into a golden age. So I sometimes wonder or theorize, George, that a lot of these ancient sites, Stonehenge, Giza, Rapa Nui, the Moai, many other sites, they seem to be geodetically connected to a lost type of energy grid. And one of the theories is that the reason why we had this energy grid was as we were going into the dark ages, they formed a system to keep the positive energy that just happens naturally. They wanted to keep that happening as long as they could. One of the ideas there, George, is if we are a binary sun, well, think about what happens in the summer or when the sun's at its full bloom. All the animals are moving around, the plants are upright and alive and doing well. Something happens with the sun. The energy that the sun gives us creates life, right? So if we were a binary solar system and we had two suns, there might be a point where those two suns are giving us energy, and somehow it feeds into our evolutionary process and allows us to evolve faster at certain points in our cycle of time. So we have to wonder if we're just coming out of a dark age and we're, on the track to another golden age, thousands of years, maybe another 8,000 years, it's very possible that extraterrestrials look at us right now in our current state and say, well, let's give them a few thousand more years to evolve to that state where they're actually more spiritually aligned to communicate with us.
Artificial intelligence and ufology, what's the mix?
As I mentioned earlier, the ability for us to go through evidence has been much more accentuated and heightened with AI. The ability to look through data and evidence exponentially faster just allows us to apply models of detection, let's say for areas where there's a lot of jungle and we can't see through. For now, we've been using things like ground-penetrating radar, sound-penetrating radar, things that can look through all the trees and the jungle and actually find pyramids or complexes that we have yet to investigate. So same thing happens there as with AI, is we have the ability to look through much faster, large amounts of area and tag things of interest that we should be investigating. The other part of this, too, I think you're going to see, George, over the next few years, literally just this week, OpenAI released a new model that is an omnidirectional AI, which essentially uses voice, video, and data to communicate to you. And it can do this in real time. So you can literally, with your phone, I saw an example of a blind person using new ChatGPT where they're just holding their phone at the street, and the phone itself can detect, here comes a cab with its yellow light on. Wow. And so it's telling the person, now you can start waving. There is a cab that's available heading up to you right now in this direction. Things like that. And so not only just in our own natural lives, when we talk about ufology and such, where I get excited, George, is when we think about the work that has been done when we have to approach a craft. There's been a downed craft, some aliens that we need to communicate with them. So now with AI, we're going to have the ability to come up with language models and ways to talk probably to others, other creatures in a way that we didn't have before. The work of Clifford Stone and others that had to manually approach and come up with some type of a baseline dialogue of communication, close encounters. They use sound and tonal vibrations. So AI, I think, is going to be something, again, that might even cross beyond just, let's say, talking to extraterrestrials, but even on our own planet. What if we had the ability to start to communicate with animals, birds, dogs, or things like that, because the language set that we could use through AI could translate and do things faster. Another quick example, in that movie Arrival, these large heptapods that look like large kind of octopus aliens, when they're interacting with them, the two researchers are using an iPad that takes the heptapod's visual language and translates it on the iPad to saying, I'm talking about a weapon. I'm talking about this. Those types of things are not too far off from reality, right? So that is pretty interesting, George, that if we have a tool in our lifetime that will allow us to communicate to a non-human intelligence, even maybe animals and such here on our own planet, huge game changer.
Okay, welcome back to Coast to Coast. You all know Giorgio Tsoukalos. He's been on with me many times, and he also stars in Ancient Aliens. Giorgio has often been described as the real-life Indiana Jones. He's a trailblazer, publisher of Legendary Times, and here he is back on Coast to Coast. Giorgio, always a pleasure.
Same here, George. Great pleasure to be back. Thank you so much for having us.
Giorgio, tell me, first of all, did you always have the high hair that you have now?
No, this was an organic byproduct. I discovered the electric socket, and people loved it, and here we are.
They did love it, and it's you. It's become like some people will wear bow ties and things like that. Your hair has become synonymous with who you are.
Well, look, if my hair gets people to talk about extraterrestrials, then what more can I ask for?
Giorgio, you have worked with Eric von Daniken. He's still going strong. He was a great influence for me in studying ufology and getting into broadcasting because I wanted to unravel these stories. How did you get to know Eric von Daniken?
Well, this was actually because I was introduced to Eric at a fairly young age, around 6 or 7, when my grandma read to me as bedtime stories, Chariots of the Gods or Edgar Case's Atlantis, those different ideas of an alternative history of mankind. But because I grew up in Switzerland, when I learned that he was also in Switzerland, when I was in my early teens, 14, 15, I started to hang out and go to his lectures. And I became friends with him and his circle of friends. And then in 1998, when the former Ancient Astronaut Society, Dr. Gene Phillips, decided to retire and not continue his research society, I approached Eric and I said I'd like to take over start an American branch of Eric von Daniken's research society, the AASRA. And here we are.
I remember being at an event with him. I think you were there too, Giorgio, years ago. And we were after the event. We were all at a restaurant and sharing a glass of wine or two. And the waiter came up to us and said, "What would you like, sir?" And I said, "Give me a glass of Merlot." And he goes up to Eric von Daniken and he went, "Give me a bottle of Merlot." One of a kind.
Always a good time with him, yes.
One of a kind. His theory on the ancient astronauts, of course, through his book, is controversial, and it wasn't accepted right away. People in the field kind of argued with him a little bit about it, didn't they?
Sure, absolutely, and I think that we've definitely seen a change of tides, because in this day and age, you'd be hard pressed to find any astrobiologist who would dispute the fact that life exists elsewhere in the universe. That's almost, even though we cannot pinpoint it, we really don't have a tangible piece of evidence as of yet, even though one could argue that as well, that we do have that with some microscopic pictures of meteorites that we found and things like that. However, today, the one taboo topic is no longer whether life exists out there. The taboo topic now is it possible that that life out there has already been here?
Exactly.
And therein lies the difference.
And, of course, I was at AlienCon a couple weeks ago in Santa Clara with Giorgio. Kevin Burns was there, too. But as I'm walking through the crowd, and it was just an immense crowd, there must have been close to 10,000 people there. There's this huge line, and I've got to get through these people. So I'm getting through them, but they're saying, "Hey, George, how are you?" I come to find out that I'm at the end of a line of maybe hundreds of people for Kevin Burns' book, Ancient Aliens, the official companion book. And I think the mistake that so many people who are skeptics about visitation, they all talk in terms of our propulsion systems. And there's no way, of course, they're going to get here the way we go out into space. They've learned how to do something different. Giorgio, what do you think it is?
Well, no, you hit the nail on the head, because, I find it always very fascinating, and it's quite understandable that we approach the extraterrestrial question by looking at it from a human perspective, which inherently makes it complicated, because even though the ancient astronaut theory suggests that we are hybrids, that we are their offspring, it still, doesn't answer a whole bunch of these questions that are at hand. And so I think it's quite fascinating.
So, Giorgio, so what's next for you with the program? Where does it go next?
Well, right now, actually, I have a couple of more lectures that I have to attend, and then I'm looking forward to a quiet holiday season. But we're actually in the process of setting up some shoots in Japan and perhaps even India, because I was just there for a promo tour for the premiere of a new season in Southeast Asia, and we ended up in Japan. And for the first time ever, was I able to check out some of the museums there. And, I always knew that Japan was an interesting place for the ancient astronaut theory. But until you visit some of these places, you have no idea what you're talking about, because standing there in front of some of these artifacts, some of which I had never seen before, new discoveries or something that I've, like I said, never seen before, that is very exciting. And so I'm very happy that the Japanese branch of the History Channel is interested in getting us there for a potential 1-hour show, and that's in the works right now. And I can't wait to return to that country, because there are some megalithic sites in Japan that blow other places out of the water.
Oh, yeah. This planet's been visited, and there are so many things out there. Let's talk a little bit about the pyramids when we come back in just a moment, and a little bit more about your work, Kevin, the book, Ancient Aliens, the official companion book. Folks, if you love the TV show, you're going to love the book, Ancient Aliens. Kevin Burns with us and Giorgio Tsoukalos. Next hour, we'll take your phone calls with them about this incredible program and about the incredible possibilities that this planet has been visited by extraterrestrials from other planetary systems, maybe other dimensions as well. We'll be back. Okay, welcome back to Coast, back with Kevin Burns, of course, creator of Ancient Aliens, and Giorgio Tsoukalos, superstar of Ancient Aliens as well. Giorgio, where have you not gone? You've traveled everywhere, haven't you?
Almost. This is why I'm very excited about this possibility of perhaps going to India, because India is one of the few places that I know a lot about, but I haven't been there personally. And so if some of the destinations that we have on the docket come true, then, see, what I've always spoken to with Kevin as well is that this journey that Ancient Aliens has taken me on has been absolutely, and I may just say it has been out of this world because, I have been to places that I never thought I would even see in my dreams. And so, I want to thank Kevin, I want to thank Prometheus and the History Channel, and above all, I want to thank the fans who have embraced the show with such love, because otherwise, without the fans, without the ratings, we wouldn't be here. And so I think that all of us, the three of us, should thank our listeners.
Oh, we do.
Thank our audience, because they're the ones who are right there with us on the journey. And I'm very, very I feel very honored to have so many people along on this journey with us together.
Good for you, Giorgio. And Giorgio, you've had fun doing this too, and that's so important, isn't it?
Yes, I mean that's the short answer. I mean it's been tremendous fun. In fact, I mean being able to travel the world and investigating true mysteries. I've never been to Loch Ness. I've never been to Portugal. These are all different places that you dream about going to, and to be able to go there, not just to investigate this, but with a competent team that makes everything run so smoothly, that to me, it's truly an amazing experience. And I find it tremendous that the shows have received such a tremendous love by the audience, and it basically shows that somehow we've struck a chord. And that, I think, is wonderful, because, people have these enduring questions, and in this day and age, some of those answers that we've been given for hundreds of years may no longer be satisfactory, and therefore shows like Ancient Aliens come along to present a different viewpoint. Not everything that we talk about is particularly, let's say, in my wheelhouse. So whenever I see something that I have to talk about, it's like going back to school. I go to my books, I scour the internet to find out, what is it now that the team at Prometheus has found out. And more often than not, I am incredibly pleased that, this crack team of researchers find stuff that some of us haven't heard before. And I think that is a great testament to the team at Prometheus.
Been doing lately?
Well, I've actually been very, very busy. I consider myself very blessed, and as you know, but I would like to share this with our listeners, back in 2009, I was consulting producer of a little television show called Ancient Aliens.
I have had more response to that little television show, Giorgio.
It's a bit of an understatement, isn't it?
You did a great job on that.
But we are, in fact, currently filming Ancient Aliens, the series, and we just filmed you a few weeks ago, and we're in the process of putting everything together. We're almost in post-production, and the show will air on the History Channel, 5 episodes starting this April. So anyone that's listening, please tune in to the History Channel in April. It's called Ancient Aliens, the series, and in most likelihood it will be aired on Saturday nights. So now you finally have something to do on Saturday.
Obviously, the History Channel liked what you did on that first show.
Well, it was, the idea was always to sort of write a love letter to Chariots of the Gods, which was Eric's seminal work back in 1970. And, you've seen the program, and I'm sure many of Coast to Coast listeners have watched the program as well. And this was truly one of the first programs ever that put the ancient astronaut theory in a positive light and presented in a way that it's downright conceivable that, we're aware ourselves that most of the stuff we talk about sounds completely off the wall. But if you look at it from a, scientific perspective, then after a while, after digging through the surface, you have to come to the conclusion that, yes, something happened in our remote past. And of course, in the ancient astronaut theory, it means that Earth has been visited by extraterrestrials in the remote past.
Yeah, I had an opportunity, Giorgio, to talk with Eric von Daniken on the program several months ago.
Wonderful.
And
he told me about it.
He has as much energy now as he had when his Chariot of the Gods book came out decades ago.
And he is writing book number 31, and Career Press just announced that his latest book, Twilight of the Gods, will be published here in the United States in July of this year. So all very exciting. I mean, History is Wrong was his last book that he published in English. That book did really well, but, someone who has already read his book, Twilight of the Gods, which is called Götterdämmerung in German, someone who's already read that, like me, I can tell you it blows most all of his books out of the water because it's absolutely ironclad, and it's very, very well researched and just magnificent. So everyone should just look forward to it. It's going to be amazing.
We're going to give people one ride tonight, but before we get into this journey, tell me a little bit more about you, Giorgio. How you got interested in the ancient astronaut theory, how you and Eric got together, where you and now are the director of the Center for Ancient Astronaut Research. How that all happened for you?
Well, that actually, the interest in the alternative history of mankind has basically been instilled on me since I was a child growing up in my home, because especially my grandma, she was very much tuned into all these subjects. And for example, I've had the privilege to travel all around the world with my parents, who were avid travelers, and they made sure that we would go to all the museums and all the archaeological sites, just as a real life education on site, this and that. But whenever I would come home, my grandma would say, "Look, now you've learned these particular mainstream ideas of this site and that site, but let me show you something else." And so she would read to me, books by Eric or books by anyone, the unsolved mysteries of the world. So that type of discussion at my home was dinner table stuff, and especially also my mom. She's always said, and I never quite understood as a little child what she meant by this, but of course, as you grow older, you change, your brain grows, and you understand what she meant. And what she basically said was that everything that exists today, like technology-wise, she always said that she thinks that all of this has already existed before at some point in time. And I never knew what she meant. And today we laugh about it because, both of my parents are, they're doctors and all this. And so I'm the only non-doctor, non-attorney, non-engineer, non-whatever in my entire family.
But you're having fun.
I'm having a lot of fun. But I'm always saying to my parents, I'm saying, look, it's your fault. You talked to me about this when I grew up,
That's
so,
right.
Just don't say anything.
My mother did the same thing to me. My father wanted me to become a dentist. She would bring me books that Walter Sullivan, the late New York Times science writer, wrote called We Are Not Alone. She'd pull out Look magazine when they had the Benny and Barney Hill Interrupted Journey story. So, she got me into all this, too. And I told her just a few weeks ago, I said, "Mom, you're the reason I'm doing what I'm doing today. Dad wanted me to be a dentist."
And this is why, after all, we can definitely be grateful to our parents and our grandparents, because we're definitely a product of the environment that we grew up in. And, we're testament to this.
Well, and I've made them both happy, Giorgio. One, I'm doing this program, which she adores. Two, I go to the dentist twice a year for my dad. Everybody wins, right?
Exactly.
Tell me a little bit about the stories of creation, because that's important to get into everything we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, and that is really a great question to start off with, because here is the very interesting idea or concept of the ancient astronaut theory, and it basically suggests that a long, long time ago, extraterrestrials visited in the Earth in the remote past. And so it doesn't matter what ancient culture you look at all of those cultures have what's considered a creation story. And what's really interesting, regardless if the story comes from the east, from the west, from the north, or from the south, all creation stories at their core are literally identical, because what you have there is that everything starts in complete darkness. And out of this complete darkness, or sometimes also referred to as the chaos or the deep dark void, a type of egg or a cosmic egg emerges from far, far away. Sometimes the egg is referred to as being silver in color, sometimes it's referred to as being golden in color, and that egg then descends onto Earth, and when the egg then cracks open and there is this bright light that emanates from it, and from there all creation begins. Now, not all these eggs crack open. Sometimes a heavenly ladder descends or is lowered from these cosmic eggs, out of which these heavenly teachers descend and teach mankind in all sorts of different disciplines. Now, we all know that cosmic eggs in that sense do not exist. So the question that I ask is, well, what did our ancestors mean when they talked about these cosmic eggs? And, so we have references to cosmic eggs. We also have references to cosmic pearls, cosmic turtles, cosmic snakes, winged snakes, flying shields, and flaming shields. So, and if you look at it from a very rudimentary point of view, all those shapes are pretty much identical or similar. I mean, a turtle can be compared to an egg. So what is it that our ancestors tried to describe or circumscribe what they saw or witnessed, or what their ancestors witnessed, so that it was compelling enough for them to put it in writing or into their traditions? Because at the outset of this program, I would like to state very clearly that our ancestors had the same brains that we have today, which means they were as intelligent as we are today. The only difference is that their technological frame of reference was different than what we have today. So therein lies the difference. Our ancestors were not stupid. On the contrary, they were as smart as we are today. However, when they got in contact with flesh and blood extraterrestrials, they did not comprehend the nuts and bolts aspects behind those visits, and thus turned it into something spiritual, something divine, something magical. Even though, by the way, I do not deny the spiritual world or the divine. Of course not. I am a deep believer in God. Of course, then the question is, what is your idea of God? I mean, it's certainly not anything out of the Old Testament, for example. But that's a whole other discussion.
That's another show.
Yeah, so there we have all these different creation stories that in and of itself are identical. And when, scientists, mainstream scientists come along and say, well, all of this is just fantasy, it's all just invented stories, that to me is an insult in the face of our ancestors.
Well, I agree with you, Giorgio, because let's say 50 years ago, if you put an iPhone in front of somebody 50 years ago, they would have no idea what it was. Exactly. But they would try to describe it the best way they could, and they'd come up with something, and that if people looked back 50 years from then, right around now, let's say, and we read that description, we'd say, boy, that's pretty weird. How they tried to come up with it, what they tried to explain.
Absolutely, and that is what is so fascinating, that in biblical times, we actually have references of magical glowing stones with which people were able to see the world and with which people received teachings. what were our ancestors describing? Did magical glowing stones really exist? Or if you place a laptop or, like what you just said, an iPhone in front of someone who has never seen something like this and, propel yourself back 5,000 years and you have, you bring a laptop with you, that laptop would become a magical tablet. And then imagine you put a DVD and you play a scene from the Grand Canyon on that. Well, that is just astonishing to whoever sees this 5,000 years ago. And thus we create a story that later then is relegated into the realm of fantasy, which it never was.
Giorgio, let's talk a little bit about Genesis. And again, here's another episode of what could have been an interpretation of ancients for what they saw. Explain.
Well, of course. And of course, Genesis, and I'm sure that many of our coast-to-coast listeners are very familiar with this, and that is the fact that if we read Genesis, then there is one particular sentence in there that says, and then God created man in their image. And grammatically speaking, that sentence really doesn't make any sense. And of course, the theologians are saying that, the there in that sentence has to do with the Holy Trinity and all this stuff. But if you look at it from the original perspective, when you look at the word God, then in the original Hebrew, the word for God is Elohim. And Elohim, and any, true scholar, if they were to translate that word correctly into correct English, the word Elohim is a plural form. It means the gods. So then, if you rewrite that sentence, the sentence correctly would have to read, and then the gods created man in their image. So that is one of the basic tenets of the ancient astronaut theory. One thing is crystal clear, that, the fossil record exists. There is no denial in that. But something happened because there was a quantum leap when we were literally munching bananas in caves, and then all of a sudden we're building civilization.
Yeah, all of a sudden we're pretty intelligent, aren't we?
Yes, and so that is what even Charles Darwin referred to. Look, Charles Darwin in his Origin of Species himself said, I like my theory, and I have to agree with him. A lot of stuff that he wrote in Origin of Species is great. However, even he himself said, but something I can't wrap my mind around, and that is why today we have the infamous missing link. And that missing link is where there is no transitional period between any of the previous humanoid species, none of our human ancestors, that, they all just appeared and disappeared. There is no transitional form. And so the ancient astronaut theory is that particular missing link.
Do you travel much when you do this research?
Oh, absolutely. You see, that is one thing that the members and also the researchers of the Center for Ancient Astronaut Research can pride themselves in, that we actually go to the places that we write about, because unfortunately we live in the time of Photoshop.
Giorgio, tell us a little bit about the theory of the possibility of an atomic war, an ancient atomic war.
Yeah, that is definitely one of the tentpoles of the ancient astronaut theory, because in ancient Indian texts we have concise references of, looked at from a modern perspective, would suggest some type of an atomic explosion or atomic explosions, plural, actually. And, the debunkers are saying that all of this is nonsense because in battle there are explosions, big explosions. And, to be honest with you, my reaction to that argument is, okay, these texts are, 4,000 years old. Did they, according to mainstream archaeology, really have explosions back then? And that is up for debate. But I'm leaning more towards the idea that no, they didn't. Nothing that was created by man or by humankind, anyhow. However, there are descriptions, and I've actually prepared a quote here from the Mahabharata. And what the debunkers are not looking at is the greater picture, because, they're only fixating on one aspect of the story, and then they're ignoring all the rest. And those descriptions are very detailed. So there's a few lines. I'm just going to read it, but this is out of the Mahabharata, and it says that he hurled a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe, an incandescent column of smoke and flame, as bright as 1,000 suns, rose in all its splendor. A perpendicular explosion with its billowing smoke clouds, the cloud of smoke rising after its first explosion, formed into expanding round circles. It was an unknown weapon, an iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death, which reduced to ashes the entire race of the Vrishnis and the Andakas. The corpses were so burned as to be unrecognizable.
Amazing.
Their hair and nails fell out. Pottery broke without apparent cause, and the birds turned white. After a few hours, all their food was infected. To escape from this fire, the soldiers threw themselves in streams of water to wash themselves and their equipment. Now, I'm sorry, George, there are multiple references in here that speak directly of something that would have to do with a nuclear blast, because only if you suffer from radiation poisoning or from nuclear fallout do your nails fall out.
How old was that text, Giorgio?
About 2,000 to 3,000 years old, and this is from ancient India. And you see, and if you read about a pillar of smoke, and that the smoke or the explosion formed into expanding round circles, that is a mushroom cloud, and there are all these other things, like, that the soldiers threw themselves into streams of water to clean themselves. That's what you have to do after you come in contact with any type of radioactivity.
Absolutely. I mean, how clear can it be? It sounds like an obvious description to some kind of atomic attack. Now, who did it exactly and why, that's another story, isn't it?
Of course. But here's the bottom line, though, George, that you and I are crazy, right? Because we're looking at this, and by the mainstream, the theories that we're proposing, even though they're crystal clear, and anyone with a half a brain can recognize this, and to even argue this, the only reason why it's being argued anyway is because, unfortunately, the great majority of mankind, scientists and religionists included, think that we are the pinnacle of creation, that, evolutionary, technological evolution, or even, spiritual evolution or development has experienced a gradual evolution from point A to point B, from point B to point C, from bottom to top, and we are at the pinnacle. We're the greatest. We're the crown of creation. We're absolutely incredible. I mean, all we're doing, we're navel-gazing. We're the best. We're the greatest. We're amazing. Yet, everything is cyclical. That what we're experiencing today is nothing else what's been going on for thousands of years. And, it's an absolute blasphemy to suggest that a technology such as nuclear power, or at least atomic bombs, existed thousands of years ago. And we have physical evidence for this.
Now, tell me about this giant crater found just outside of Mumbai in India.
Right. I mean, I'm glad you bring that up, because, that is basically, it's called the Lonar Crater, which is located 400 kilometers northeast of Mumbai, and it's dated less than 50,000 years old, and it's this nearly circular 2,100-meter diameter crater.
It's huge.
It's huge, almost perfect.
And no remnants of an asteroid?
Nothing.
Wow.
And that is exactly what I was getting at, because the only way, and see, at the center of this structure or of this crater, we have these basalt glass spheres that could have only been created if that area had been exposed to high degrees of heat. And no volcanoes in the area, by the way.
No.
And no meteorite. So, I mean, you know, nature can do amazing things, but at the same time, you know, sometimes you also have to go with logic. And if nature by herself cannot create something like this, well, then there's only one solution to this, and that is some type of an outside force besides nature created this, or, you know, had the effect of creating something like this.
Now, I'm going to ask you to speculate, because that's what this is, but I'm just curious to get your take, because I'm sure you've tried to think, what happened? What occurred? Why was there a battle?
Well, I mean, you see, here is the thing that, you know, I sort of disagree with in the whole alternative history field, and that is, you know, a lot of people, you know, especially UFO people, they're always not, and of course I'm generalizing, George. I'm not saying that everyone is like this, but in general, everyone says that the moment that, you know, extraterrestrials show up in their UFOs, all of our problems will be solved, everything will be great, we'll have, you know, free energy, this and that. Now, while I think that that is possible, I am more of the conviction that, you know, how we have problems on this planet, there are problems out there. It's not all perfect out there. It's just a bigger version of everything that's going on here. There is good, and then there is evil. You know, everything, you know, good and evil penetrates or you know, encompasses the entire universe. And I'm also a believer that in the end, good outweighs the bad. However, so if we have those ancient texts where these battles are described, in my opinion, and, you know, in Zechariah Sitchin's opinion, Eric von Daniken, and all other sorts of ancient astronaut theorists, is that those extraterrestrials who came here, there is a possibility that they crash landed. And so there were some types of mutinies going on where all of a sudden some people of the crew did no longer agreed with the commander, and so they started to have these factions, and these battles started. And we have very concise references for this. I mean, one example, for example, is Lucifer. I mean, Lucifer was a part of, quote-unquote, God's crew. And I'm not saying that God was an extraterrestrial, but I am suggesting that whoever or whatever was described in the Old Testament Bible was not God in that sense, but a misunderstood flesh and blood extraterrestrial. And so those ancient texts that describe these battles are between these quote-unquote gods that are fighting between each other. And just to be clear, whenever I say gods, and I know you agree with me on that one, it's always lowercase g.
Yes.
It has nothing to do with, you know, capital G, God. And so, you know, it is amazing that in ancient India, especially now that we're talking about these atomic explosions, were you aware that whenever these weapons of this incredible force, whenever they were deployed, they were always hurled from these flying machines called vimanas, and we have these concise descriptions of flying chariots in ancient Indian texts that were piloted by the gods. And still today, in the Hindi language, the word viman means airplane. So we have a surviving mythology in language that has survived to this day.
Absolutely. Now, there's a British researcher, his name of Indian origin, David Davenport. Mm-hmm. He spent at least 12 years studying ancient Hindu scripts, and he concludes that there was this atomic explosion 4,000 years ago?
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting point here. In 1975, David Davenport published a book in India. He lived in India, but he published a book in Italy, and the title was 2000 Anticristo Distruzione Atomica, which in English means atomic destruction in 2000 BC. And in that book, Davenport claimed to have proof that Mohenjo-Daro, one of the oldest cities in the world of human civilization, had been destroyed by an atomic bomb. And what he basically proposed was that, and he basically just addressed mainstream archaeologists, because at Mohenjo-Daro we have thousands of these glassy lumps, which are called the black stones, and they turn out to be fragments of clay vessels which had melted into each other in some type of an extreme heat. And that extreme heat, he proposes, was about 2,000 degrees centigrade, which is about 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit. And when they got down to the levels of the skeletons of the people that died right there at Mohenjo-Daro, all of those people just lied there, unburied, hand in hand sometimes.
Like Nagasaki, like Hiroshima.
See, this is why I love talking to you, George. Exactly. And in fact, one Soviet professor, or Russian, sorry about that, one Russian scholar back in the day when it was still the Soviet Union, actually did research there, and they determined that one of the skeletons had a radiation level 50 times greater than normal. Now, this is all very wild stuff, and nobody talks about it.
This is incredible, truly incredible work. Is he still alive, do you know?
That, unfortunately, I'm not aware. I don't know. I don't know.
He would be a great one for your History Channel shows.
Yeah, absolutely.
If he's still
for sure.
out there. Well, we'll do some checking. Both of us will.
Wonderful.
There's another expert out there by the name of William Sturm, and I think he is still alive. He has said that the melting bricks at this town you just mentioned, how do you pronounce that?
Mohenjo-Daro.
Mohenjo-Daro could not have been caused. The melting bricks, he said, could not have been caused by a normal fire.
No, and Mohenjo-Daro is not the only place. We have also in Saudi Arabia, we have a site that has these spherules. We have that in the Sinai Peninsula. I mean, today's Israel, so, can you say Sodom and Gomorrah? I mean, there we have a biblical story that possibly describes some type of a atomic bomb that went off that, made Lot's wife turn into a pillar of salt. I mean, again, those stories, of course, are stories. They're legends. But what I'm after is the core. What compelled our ancestors to put this in writing, or at least put in their oral traditions, because they most certainly did not just sit around a campfire and, got drunk or were smoking dope, and then all of a sudden they were like, all right, well, what should we come up with tonight? No. What they wrote down and what they put in their oral traditions, it was their history. Just like today, we put stuff in the newspaper that really is going on. And to suggest that everything our ancestors, wrote down on paper is nothing but fantasy, who is insulting whom here? The mainstream scientists are insulting me and are saying that Eric and I and Zechariah Sitchin, that we're insulting our ancestors. But are we really? I don't think so, because the mainstream scientists are saying, in fact, that everything that we read in ancient times, we have to take it with a grain of salt because our ancestors just didn't get it. So everything was just divine, and everything had to do with the gods, and they did not exist. And it was just a way of coming to grips with the world. Now that, to me, that is the slap in our ancestors' face.
And you've heard the stories of in the deserts of the Middle East, they see glass deep down, as if it was created by some kind of atomic explosion.
And that is what I'm actually referring to about Saudi Arabia. Exactly. Yes. So, and none of that stuff could happen by the sunlight alone, because, both you and I have been in the desert. It's incredibly hot. I mean, it's crazy. You just want to lay down and sleep. I mean, it is very hot.
It's hot, but you're not going to make glass this way.
Exactly. And again, in the desert, you don't necessarily have volcanic activity. So the only way that could have been possible is it was some type of a blast, or at least some technology that has been lost ever since.
Well, Michael Cremo, in his Forbidden Archaeology, talks about humankind being millions and millions of years old, and who knows what kind of technology we could have had. Though I think, Giorgio, you and I subscribe to the ancient astronaut theory, it is possible that we had intelligence on this planet that was humankind, and they blew themselves up as well.
Like we're about to?
Like we could.
Well, I don't mean to
That was kind of scary, the way you said that.
Well, look, I'm always a guy that says that the glass is half full instead of half empty, but, there's so many bizarre thinking people out there right now who unfortunately believe strongly, and I mean the word believe, not that they know. They believe it. There's faith involved about the end times. And that really concerns me, because there's people in power who believe in the end times. And I think that's very disconcerting because, for example, the Maya never said that the world will end in 2012. They never said that.
Never.
So we should just get away from that. The world will go on. Everything will be fine, because this is not the end. So we should get away from this doom and gloom idea of.
Giorgio Tsoukalos, our special guest tonight. Giorgio, tell me about what you've been studying about ancient dragon myths and China's folklore and Native American Thunderbirds. I remember you talking about that when you were with me when you were taping the History Channel's Ancient Aliens. Let's get into that.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is all quite fascinating, because if you look at the ancient myths of China, but also the Native American stories, the Chinese folklore or traditions, they refer to these dragons, and Native American traditions refer to the Thunderbirds. And, coming from the ancient astronaut perspective, I've always asked myself, did the ancient Chinese, did the Native Americans really truly mean that biological entities such as dragons or thunderbirds existed in real life? And I've pretty much come to the conclusion that once again, that is not necessarily the case, but that what we have here is another example of misunderstood technology. Now, mind you, I'm not the first to have come to this conclusion. In 1928, the American writer by the name of Berthold Laufer wrote a book by the name with the title "The Prehistory of Aviation," and in it there were a whole bunch of bizarre wood carvings that he saw or that he was able to look at when he visited China back in the day. And what surprised the author, and he was, by the way, he was also an anthropologist, so he was not just some tourist or something like this. I mean, he was a scientist. He was surprised that in all of these wood carvings that he saw in China, that there were all these very bizarre carvings of flying chariots that were drawn by dragons. And along with the texts that go along with these carvings, these dragons were always described to arrive with a lot of noise and thunder and smoke, and the earth was trembling. And then the moment those dragons, quote unquote, landed on the ground with their iron feet, out of their mouth, or sometimes out of their belly, the first Chinese emperors came out. So, and they were always known as the divine rulers from the sky, the divine sky rulers, or the teachers from heaven. So, if you look at the same story in Native American myths, you have these references of the Thunderbirds.
What we think are the big birds, right?
Exactly. And mind you, while, I will not, go ahead and knock cryptozoology, I mean, we don't know if any of those big birds truly exist.
Right. Or maybe they're pterosaurs. Who knows?
Exactly. However, if I have stories in Native American myth where these Thunderbirds are described to come out of the deep, dark void, which in my opinion is another description for deep space, or sometimes referred to as the deep coldness or the deep emptiness or something like this. And then these Thunderbirds descended in this big, amount of noise and smoke and the earth trembling again, and then out of their beak, they lowered their beak, and out of those beaks came what's called the Kachinas, the heavenly teachers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we all have seen Kachinas. If you go to any type of, Native American souvenir shop, there are these wonderfully carved figures, many of which have an animal character to them, but some of them, if you look closely, they're wearing helmets, they have wings, they have these visors, very bizarre, renditions of these beings. And if you ask the Native Americans, they will tell you that the Kachinas were, in fact, star people, and that those star people manifested themselves and then taught mankind in various disciplines. Now, when I hear the word manifested, then personally, I don't believe that those people came out of nowhere or those Kachinas came out of the spiritual realm, but let's say they arrived in those quote-unquote Thunderbirds. People were unable to see them right away, but they then manifested themselves the moment that Thunderbird opened its beak and they were able to walk out of it. Now, the Thunderbird, in the ancient national opinion, was some type of a vehicle with which they were able to travel from one place to the other. And so we have all these different references where, these Thunderbirds are also sometimes referred to as being made of metal. And so were those dragons. And by the way, the Chinese traditions and the Native American traditions are not the only ones that speak of dragons or some type of flying birds. Even in ancient Greece, which obviously, is a much younger culture than China. However, around the island of Crete, there was a monster that was gleaming with a bronze, impenetrable skin. And anyone who has read the Argonautica with Jason and the Argonauts.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, that thing, that quote-unquote monster, was protecting the island of Crete. And the only way to conquer the monster is if you went down to its heel and you sort of unplugged this screw or this mallet made of bronze or gold, and the moment that screw was removed, this oozing black liquid, thick liquid removed the blood of the monster, and only then were you able to conquer the monster, because due to the lack of this liquid, all of its joints started to, lock up. Now, can you say oil? Or can you say some type of a hydraulic system?
Mm-hmm.
because obviously our ancestors, once again, and I cannot repeat myself with this enough, but our ancestors were highly intelligent, but their technological frame of reference was different than what we have today. So they had to describe it with the words and with the vocabulary that were at their disposal. So obviously, some type of a machine got turned into a monster, something out of this world.
Oh, if they had seen a submarine emerge,
exactly,
what do you think they would have said?
They would have said Jonah and the whale.
Yeah.
Because Jonah was most certainly not swallowed by a whale.
That's a good point.
Because
these events happened, but not the way they said.
Right. I mean, there's always, and this is why we live in such magnificent times right now, because we can look at these ancient texts from a modern perspective and recognize that stuff that we have today existed in one form or the other a long time ago.
You have sent us a couple pictures of massive monoliths that we've got posted at coasttocoastam.com. Mm-hmm. Explain these to us.
Well, the black and white picture that we have on coasttocoastam.com right now is a picture that was taken in the 50s of Baalbek in Lebanon. Mm-hmm. And Baalbek is a very popular site in all of the alternative history field. And the reason why it's so popular is the fact that this is, the site, well, this town was known as Heliopolis, where the sun god Baal was worshipped. And yes, the Romans later used this temple. It was one of their most magnificent temples that they ever had. However, even the Romans themselves said in their chronicles that they themselves stumbled upon the foundations of this temple way after this thing had been built in the remote past. And so if you look at this picture, the reason why I love it is because you have a tiny human being just leaning against the second level of stones. And then the third level above that human being, you see a massive, massive megalithic slab where, something like this, and I'm going to say it, George, we could not do today with none of our equipment. Because, now today on the National Geographic Channel and all those wonderful channels, you see, all this, what do you call it, mega builders or engineers, how they recreate stuff and they're transporting big blocks of stone or big blocks of steel and all of this. But the stones we have at Baalbek, especially what we see in this picture, we would have difficulties, if not impossible, to transport this from place A to place B. And this here is thousands of years old, and our ancestors allegedly did this with ropes, pulleys, and with wooden rollers. And I say, whoever suggests something like this is retarded. And I have no compunction of saying that.
Don't hold back, George.
Oh, I won't. I'm on a roll now. No, but the thing is, the bottom line is, and I would like to just go ahead and talk about the second picture that we have on coasttocoastam.com.
This is a strange one.
It is very much so. And the reason why I said that, anyone who suggests that our ancients were able to do this with chisel technology is retarded.
Primitive tools.
With primitive tools is retarded because For Ancient Aliens, the series, which will air in April, and we're all looking forward to it, and I hope everyone will tune in on the History Channel in April. We actually had the privilege, because there is something I wanted to do the first time around, and due to time constraints, we couldn't do it, but this time we were able to do it for the series, and that is, I wanted to go and talk to a real-life stone cutter, a real-life stonemason who,
Good
cuts stones for a living.
Yeah.
And We actually had the privilege
with good tools.
Exactly, and we had the privilege of doing this about 6-7 weeks ago. And so not only did we see what it takes today to cut a piece of granite, I mean, all I can tell you is it's very powerful, it's very loud, and it takes hours, okay? But we also, brought him pictures such as this one. And this carving of the stone block, especially I'm referring to the light gray stone block on the right, this can be found at my favorite site in the world, Pumapunku, in the highland of Bolivia, in the Andes, on the border of Peru and Bolivia, where Lake Titicaca connects the two countries.
It's one of Eric's good ones, too, isn't it?
Yes,
yeah.
And in fact, Twilight of the Gods, the new book that will be published, will have an entire section of that.
Beautiful.
And what we have here, while it doesn't look impressive size-wise, from a stone-cutting perspective, when I showed this to the stone cutter, he pretty much told me, Giorgio, please put this away. This is giving me a headache. Because he then also proceeded to say that today we could only do this with precision computer technology. And, the mainstream archaeologists are saying that we did this, or our ancestors did this. They carved this, allegedly, with chicken bones and with obsidian. Now, what we have here is diorite. Diorite is an extremely hard igneous rock, and I'm sorry, it doesn't work with chicken bones and with diorite. And you see, when you have especially the little square at the bottom that's the deepest, you can't cut that out, because the question that the stonecutter had is, how do you release the back of that rectangle or that square? You can't.
No, you can't at all. Why this planet, Giorgio? Why come here? Or do you think this was a mission of these ETs, and they just went to as many Earth-like planets as they could find?
Thank you very much. That would have been exactly my answer, because, obviously, in our quadrant, our planet would stick out like a sore thumb. However, that does not mean that Earth is unique, that we're the only planet in our galaxy that is inhabited. I mean, just to, revive Carl Sagan, billions and billions of galaxies are out there, billions and billions of stars, each of which has planetary systems. I mean, to suggest that we're the only ones, which some scientists do, it defies logic. So, were they here? Absolutely. Did they also visit other planets? 100%. Because just like, all the stuff that we've seen, and I know it's a human creation, but, the worlds or the ideas behind Star Wars or Star Trek, I really think that the creators of those stories, Roddenberry and Lucas, they were onto something, that just like everything exists the way it does here on Earth, different races, different species, different everything, it exists out there. And some of them get along, some of them don't. And we're just this part of a bigger picture. And one day, hopefully, we'll have the privilege to join that big intergalactic club that's out there. It's not a right, by the way. It's a privilege, because right now we're a very, very dangerous planet. And, I doubt that they want any official participation of us in that club out there, because we're too violent.
Do you think the ETs that we're talking about are the alien grays or the Nordics that look like us, or we look like them?
It could be all of them. You see, I don't think that we were visited by just one species, but multiple. And, your very last question right there is, do we look like them, is a resounding yes. Because, you see, the question is not, what do the extraterrestrials look like?
And you pull out Genesis, in God's image.
Exactly. So if extraterrestrials, quote-unquote, created us in their image, wouldn't that lead to the conclusion that who cares what the aliens look like? The bottom line is, the question that we should ask is, do we look like the aliens?
I want you to address this one for just a second, Giorgio, and that would be so many people who are staunch believers in the word of the Bible, by the word, and, you know, they're hearing this tonight. I want you to temper that, because you've said time and time again, you believe in God.
Absolutely.
So explain that for me. Their belief in the Bible and the fact that it does not negate what you've been working on, and vice versa.
Right, because you see, what we're working on is essentially to prove the point that not only have we been visited by extraterrestrials in the remote past, but that would inherently mean that the entire universe, or at least our galaxy, that there's at least one other species out there. Now, to me, that is a wonderful, wonderful thought in regards to religion, because it essentially means that God's creation was way bigger, way more magnificent than if, you know, God would have only created life on Earth. I mean, if we're truly, as some scientists and some religionists believe, if we're the only species in the entire galaxy, even in the entire universe, that to me would be an insult in the face of God's great creation, because it means that God essentially was only able to create us, and that is not very flattering.
Giorgio, the Ark of the Covenant. You've got some interesting things to say about this.
Yes. And my question is it actually possible whether or not the Ark of the Covenant is of alien origin?
Why would you think that?
Well, because there are multiple references in the Bible that essentially describe that, you know, the ark was needed to transport something. And according to popular belief, it was the tablet of Moses that were transported in it. However, if you look at the apocryphal texts, which used to belong to the Bible but are no longer part of the Bible since the Council of Nicaea, and also some of the ancient Hebrew texts, what we find there, especially in the Zohar, in what is a part of the Kabbalah, we have a description of what's referred to as the Ancient of Days. And the Ancient of Days, you know, in popular idea, is thought to be a description of God. But back in the 70s, these two electrical engineers by the name of George Sassoon and Rodney Dale, they came to the conclusion that the Ancient of Days wasn't necessarily a description of God, but it was a description of some type of a machine. And this machine, the Ancient Days, correctly translated into English, would be the transportable one with the tanks. What tanks? What is described here? So they looked at this thing, this creature that was truly described in the Zohar. And by the way, anyone can go out and you know, get a copy of the Zohar and read this. I mean, Gregory Mather's book, The Kabbalah Decoded, is one of the seminal works on the Zohar and the Kabbalah. And you read about this thing with, you know, different faces and different brains and clear beards with tubes that went from one brain to the other, and these arms, and then this bright light which, you know, forwarded this liquid inside, and then all of a sudden at night's end or in the morning, you have what's referred to as the manna. And, you know, out of this machine, out of these tanks, the priests were able to siphon off this manna. Because if we look at the manna story, that it came from heaven, quote unquote heaven, you know, the conventional ideas that it was the excretion of some insects, or it was the morning dew, or something like this. If you expose this to a little bit more scrutiny, none of those mundane explanations really hold water. So that is exactly what Sassoon and Dale were exploring. What is it that is behind this manna? And so, to make a long story short, they then explained or suggested that the manna machine that they called this machine that produced the manna was stored inside the Ark of the Covenant, which then was transported all over the place.
That's fascinating.
And so, also in medieval texts like Wolfram von Eschenbach in his Parzival legend and all the Arthurian legends, the idea is that the reason why the Templars were so many years in Jerusalem, they were there primarily to find this Ark of the Covenant, to find the Ark, and then to actually find the manna machine. And if we all look at Templar lore, they allegedly were in possession of what's called the Baphomet. And the Baphomet was this quote-unquote idol that they were accused of devil worship and, wrong things that they never actually did. But that this Baphomet had these glowing red eyes, and anyone who came close to it, started to have problems health-wise. And by the way, even the Ark of the Covenant, there are descriptions in the Bible that some people who went close to the Ark of the Covenant who were not the initiates,
they got electrocuted or something,
and
didn't they?
Died. Some of them even lost their hair and lost their nails, and they had boils on their skin.
Sounds
their
like
body.
radiation poisoning.
Thank you. And that is what what Sassoon and Dale proposed, that this machine had a very, very small nuclear reactor inside of it, and I think that the Ark, there's two ideas. One, that it's hidden somewhere in Aksum, which is in Ethiopia, or
in a church, right?
Exactly, deep down in the ground, and only the guardian of that church is able to look at it. And by the way, all of these guardians, it's a sort of a family tradition or a family job. All of them have eye problems after about 20 years, which is very interesting because they allegedly aren't allowed to look at the Ark, and then something happens to their eyes. I mean, it can be a genetic effect that runs in that family, or it could be something else that we don't know of. I mean, it's highly fascinating. Now, the other idea is that we all know the story, and all Coast to Coast listeners know this, about the infamous money pit on Oak Island.
Yes, in Canada, right?
Exactly, in Nova Scotia and Halifax. And there we have this bizarre borehole where, for 100 years now, people have spent millions and millions of dollars to get to the bottom of this pit. And they've all failed miserably because of this ingenious flooding system that keeps on, flooding the shafts. And but what they've discovered is when they went down with endoscopic cameras is they found those boxes that are sort of the same size as is described, the size that the Ark of the Covenant was. And at one time, someone also determined that there were high levels of radiation down there. Now that, let me perk up because I was like, well, that is very fascinating. Now, one of the most eminent Ark of the Covenant researchers, Peter Feebog, actually was interviewed for Ancient Aliens, the series. So we're going to go into more detail about all of this when the series airs, and I can't wait to see what they've done with this.
Well, that is a fascinating possibility, Giorgio. It just adds to the puzzle, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And, just the idea, I mean, if the Ark of the Covenant or the manna machine one day is recovered from the money pit, I mean, it's over. The ancient astronaut theory will be proven, and, everyone else will say, Okay, fantastic. I mean, that'll be us. But I predict that all the scientists will say, well, we knew it all along, but we couldn't say anything because, we were at the university and we had to have, we had to remain quiet. So that's the only thing that concerns me.
Tell me a little bit about the Golden Record. What is that?
Well, the Golden Record are basically these phonograph records which were included aboard both Voyager spacecrafts which were launched in 1977. Now, the reason why I'm fascinated about this is because not only did this record contain 55 greetings in all different kinds of languages of planet Earth, but also it contained pictures.
And it was like a map back to the planet, wasn't it?
Exactly, and it was all made out of gold, and
was it like a CD?
Yeah, I mean, almost. I mean, it's actually like a regular one of those old records that we existed before the CD came along.
Yeah.
And it works with a stylus, and and there are these drawings on that record with instructions of how this stylus or how this record would work. And they all did this with binary arithmetic because, the correct time of one rotation of the record is 3.6 seconds, and they expressed this in a unit of time of 0.7 billionths of a second, which is the time period associated with fundamental transition of the hydrogen atom, which is constant throughout the entire universe. So whoever finds this should, big emphasis on should know this. So not only do we have these greetings on there, but we also have analog pictures. Now, one analog picture on there is of Egypt, the Red Sea, and the Sinai Peninsula and the Nile. Now, that to me is already very fascinating because, allegedly, that is where we made first contact in Sumerian times with the Anunnaki. Second, one of the languages that is recorded on both of these golden records on board the Voyager spacecraft or space probe is Sumerian. Now, both you and I and all of our listeners know Sumerian is a dead language. Why on earth would they include Sumerian on that record?
Because they used to know it.
Thank you very much. I mean, that is exactly it. So could that be a hidden way of, bringing out the message? Maybe
that's their way of saying welcome back.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Oh, and another thing that's very, very fascinating is that, the record itself is electroplated with uranium-238, and, the half-life of uranium-238 decays in about 4.51 billion years. And so if you examine that record and you examine the decay of uranium-238, whoever discovers this can determine the elapsed time since this space probe, traveled into deep space. So, I mean, this is magnificent stuff. It's great that we've done this. I mean, I'm very excited about it.
Do you think aliens are here among us right now, Giorgio?
Aren't you one, George?
Well, you never know. Don't blow my cover, Giorgio.
Okay, it's just between you and me then. No one's listening. Lord Martin Rees of he's an astronomer royal of the United Kingdom. He actually just recently said that aliens could be amongst us, and we may not even be able to recognize them. And my hat goes off to that guy because he is absolutely right. Because he says that just as a chimpanzee can't understand quantum theory, it could be that these extraterrestrials are literally standing right in front of our eyes, and we can't recognize them. Now,
yes.
I don't mean that, I'm looking at you or you're looking at me and I'm an extraterrestrial, but that literally those extraterrestrials could be invisible because of their technology or their, advanced, being. Because one thing is crystal clear, that while ants live on our planet, they have literally no idea that we exist. So that could be the same way with extraterrestrials, because just like they're way more advanced, we are more advanced than ants, so that could play out exactly the same way with extraterrestrials.
All of this, as we get back to Eric von Daniken, I think ties in tremendously with the work you've been doing, both as the publisher of Legendary Times and also the Ancient Astronaut Research Center. So tell me about that center.
Well, the Center for Ancient Astronaut Research is an organization, a research society that Eric von Daniken and I founded on June 17th in 1998, so 12 years ago. And we're pretty much dedicated to determining whether or not extraterrestrials visited Earth in the remote past. And as such, we publish a magazine called Legendary Times, and it's the only magazine in the world to exclusively dedicate its pages to the ancient astronaut theory. And so all, the who is who in ancient astronaut research, they all publish their latest stuff in the pages of Legendary Times magazine. Eric von Daniken writes in almost every issue. I myself, of course, write in every issue, but we've also got David Childress, Jason Martell, Zechariah Sitchin has submitted articles.
You've got some heavyweights in there. Let me tell you.
Because the thing is that there has got to be some type of a voice that is dedicated to this specific research, because we will not delve into, other areas of research like UFOs or modern UFOs. See, our UFOs happened thousands and thousands of years ago. That doesn't mean that we disagree with modern ufology, but, we write about ancient astronauts. And by the way, anyone who goes to legendarytimes.com tonight and clicks on free info, if you fill out the information, everyone will get a free issue tonight, and we'll send it to you. But please be patient, because
you get swamped.
Yes, exactly. And, I'm like an issue or two behind with publishing Legendary Times, but it's been such a tremendous, incredible year for me, which means, a lot of people have expressed their interest in Legendary Times, but at the same time, I'm scrambling, so I ask for everyone's patience, please, because while it looks like we're a big organization, we're really not. It's a couple of people that do this. So, I'm very appreciative of all my fans, all my subscribers, all the members of Legendary Times. It's them who keep this research going. And, whenever people ask me, how can we get involved? What can we do to help you and Eric with your research? The answer is become a member. Become a member of Legendary Times and the Center for Ancient Astronaut Research, because, that is the way how we fund our research. That is how we organize our expeditions and how we, get all the materials together. And, if you get the magazine, 64 pages, from first page to the last, it's all articles. There are no ads in there. It's all membership supported. And you've seen issues, right? You're reading it, right? You enjoy it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Of everything you've investigated, which thing really just drives you crazy? Just as incredible.
Puma Punku. Every time Puma Punku is, in my opinion, is the smoking gun. While there are other areas that I find fascinating, the pyramids, the Nazca lines, those are all great. However, Puma Punku, because when you go there, it just you shake your head, because all those stones, also what I didn't mention before, display or feature what's called vitrification, which is a occurrence that only happens if you heat up the stone to a very high temperature, and then the stone sort of melts, and then it hardens into place again. and then it has this surface as if it were a bathroom mirror. And so all the stones at Pumapunku feature exactly that. It's perfect.
Well, the story you told us about the atomic war, too, that to me is absolutely staggering.
Yeah. No, and you know, again, the thing is that all these stories that we've talked about tonight, they happen or happened all over the world, in every culture. It doesn't mean that, you know, none of this, for example, happened none of this happened in Europe. Of course it did. Ancient Greece is filled with these stories. So are the Scandinavian countries. Even in, you know, the English and Irish parts of the world, in honor of St. Patrick's Day today, you know, even that part of the world talked about legends of these weird, bizarre beings, the shining ones, who, according to those legends, came from the stars. Eric von Daniken himself, when he wrote the foreword for the 35-year edition of Chariots of the Gods, he actually admitted that, you know, there were mistakes in the original Chariots of the Gods. Now, find me one other researcher, especially in the mainstream, who will say, yep, I made a mistake 40 years ago. It virtually does not exist. So the thing is that, you know, Eric, you know, one thing that nobody talks about is the fact that Chariots of the Gods not only had a question mark on the book cover, but in the book itself, there are over 200 question marks. So it's not like everything was stated as a matter of fact, but they were questions.
Right.
And so now, though, with Twilight of the Gods, I mean, I've read the German version twice now, and I'm working on, you know, Twilight of the Gods as being one of the editors. You know, there aren't that many mistakes there anymore, and I think it's wonderful because, you know, science has changed, new evidence has come along, and some of the stuff that will be presented in that book is completely irrefutable. The story of Ezekiel, if you look at the book of Enoch, if you look at the Apocalypse of Abraham, if you look at the Apocalypse of Baruch, they were all taken up. They were all taken up. An ascension of some kind in a fiery chariot or in the glory of the Lord. And, you know, according to the ancient astronaut theory, the glory of the Lord, or, you know, those fiery chariots, weren't necessarily, you know, figments of their imagination, or that these people weren't necessarily experiencing a vision in their minds, but that were actual physical events where those biblical figures were taken up in some type of a machine, in some type of a spaceship, a vehicle, a vimana, what have you, because whenever they arrived, wherever they were going, they explained in very great detail that, you know, all of a sudden they were in a new world, that a big house with, like a palace, with white walls. And on those walls, there were all these different jewels, and everything was blinking and glistening and just shiny like a sea of jewels. Now, if you ever boarded a plane, and the moment you board a plane, you look to the left and you look at inside the flight deck, you have all these different controls and these blinking lights. Now, somebody who doesn't know what that is, or who has never seen something like that before, the best way to describe something like that is this treasure chest of gold and jewels. We also have to remember that our ancestors tried to describe something with words that were at their disposal at the time. So we have not only those descriptions of these shining lights on the walls and these glowing stones, these glowing magical tablets, but also whenever they got there, you know, the people that they were surrounded by spoke a different language. They didn't understand who they were. And also, you know, they were always brought to the highest of the highest. And, you know, they were taught for example, Enoch was given this tool, this fast writing tool. It was sort of like a reed. and all of a sudden Enoch was able to write extremely fast. Now, my question is, what was that magical tool or that magical reed that Enoch had in his hands with which he was able to write? So there are countless of descriptions like that. And I mentioned this, I think, in my last appearance on Coast to Coast, but one of the most fascinating stories is the Apocalypse of Abraham, where he also is described. And by the way, all those books used to be, like I mentioned before, a part of the Bible, but they were taken out later in the Council of Nicaea because they were deemed too dangerous. They contained too much information. And
I wonder if would they be allowed today?
Oh, you can go buy them. You can buy them at any. Well, no, you don't have to even buy them. You can just go to the library or online,
and there they are.
And there they are. I mean, they're obviously reprints, but they're called the Apocrypha.
Okay. And
the Apocalypse of Abraham describes Abraham being taken up by the quote-unquote Lord, lowercase l, and when he got to this new place, he got very sick because he describes that he was standing at a window and he saw his world down below, which was Earth, in a sea of black, by the way he describes it. And then it was as if I was falling down towards Earth, and then Earth appeared again at the top, and then I fell down again, and Earth appeared again at the top. And he was standing at a window describing this. So that is, from a modern perspective, a description of artificial gravity. If that was a wheel in space that was turning on its own axis, that is exactly what you would see if you were to stand in front of a window in an orbiting city in space. We look at all fields of science, all fields of archaeology, whether it be Egyptology or if it's ancient South American studies or African studies. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's all under the same umbrella for us, and we try to draw these comparisons and these correlations because, yes, the airstrip is in Peru, and they're essentially the Nazca lines. And mind you, no one in the ancient astronaut theory has ever suggested that they were landing strips. I mean, the only thing we've ever said was that seen from the air, which is the only way, by the way, you can see them, is that all of this really looks like airstrips. I mean, they truly do look like airstrips because it's just like this giant airfield with these landing strips that look like landing strips. And then you have the figures, like you mentioned, the spider, but you also have a whale, you have a hummingbird, you have another being that's called the El Astronauta, the astronaut, with one hand pointing down to Earth and one hand pointing to the sky. And so there's all these bizarre geoglyphs that are huge. I mean, some of these lines and these bands go for as long as 23 kilometers over valleys and mountains. But the most significant thing at Nazca, for sure, are the areas where entire mountaintops have just been removed and flattened. It's as if somebody took a cheese knife and just shaved the mountaintop off because the surrounding mountains converge at a summit, and there are two mountains at Nazca where the summit is missing, and clearly, and anyone can look at the pictures, the mountaintops have been removed, flattened. And as far as the crystal skulls are concerned, all I have to say on that topic is the fact that we today, in modern computer technology, are using crystals for information storage. So is it possible that the crystal skulls, 13 of which allegedly exist on or have been deposited on planet Earth, contain information? The possibility most certainly is there.
Well, that's true. How windy is it up there on the Nazca Plateau?
Very, and that actually, is expressed that, whenever something actually grows there, it's only in shrub form, including trees. I mean, if a tree grows there, it's very stunted. So it can get very windy there. Of course, obviously it's a desert. It can get very, very hot, very, very cold at night. So it's quite an arid and hostile environment.
With Eric von Daniken's theories, when you first heard them, what'd you think?
I thought that is what adventure should be like, because I was always interested in archaeology, but looking at a shard of pottery to me is not very exciting. But if I get big walls, big geoglyphs, megalithic structures, the bigger the better, where you can't even put a dollar bill in between the fittings in some cases, that is exciting. That's excitement to me, because it just gets my mind going. How was this possible, especially in light of the fact that we ourselves today, with our modern technology, would have a hard time recreating this? Our ancestors were extremely prolific and very meticulous in writing this stuff down, and so for all that to get lost to the flames of fires, I mean, that is truly, truly unfortunate. Here's the thing. If you look at a science textbook of, let's say, 100 years ago, 99% of that knowledge, and I'm, of course, overgeneralizing, but 99% of that knowledge contained in that textbook is today obsolete. Now, even though at the time when that book was published 100 years ago, that knowledge was cutting edge. So I'll make one prediction, that 100 years from now, there will only be a few theories that will still hold true, and one of them will be the ancient astronaut theory, and one of the founders, or the biggest proponent was, or most known proponent was Eric von Daniken, so respect will come. Everything in life comes down to energy. And in order to perform or conduct time travel, you need a crapload of energy. And so, to make a long story short, time travel per se, going into the past, theoretically speaking, is possible. However, we're, of course, hundreds, if not thousands of years away from actually building a machine with which we're able to actually time travel. So what physicists have suggested, or not suggested, but they've actually proven it, that the energy requirements to power a time machine are infinitely larger than what we would need to power a spaceship with which to travel from star to star. So from a logical perspective, we will first succeed in traveling to a distant star or a planetary system before we will succeed in time traveling. Now, that does not mean that I'm saying that time travel is not possible. Of course it is, or it already has been, one way or the other. But from a energy requirement perspective, we will first explore the galaxy in spaceships before we will visit ourselves in the past, due to the simple fact that the energy requirements to power a time machine are infinitely larger than to power a spaceship.
Giorgio, have you dealt with at all the Dogon tribe and their Sirius mystery of the Sirius star system?
Oh, of course. And we've actually just written a big article about this in Legendary Times. Good. And, there are so many people who have suggested that, the whole idea that the Dogon knew about the Sirius A and the Sirius B constellations is nothing but a hoax, that it was they were infiltrated, and that knowledge was given to them by some ethnologists that visited the tribe,
the French explorers, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. And that really, if you dig deeper, can't be true, because the Dogon have a festival. It's called the Rice Festival, the Sigi Festival, that they celebrate every 50 to 52 years, and that coincides exactly with an orbit of that invisible companion star that they said existed, which, by the way, years later then was indeed confirmed by modern astronomy with our modern instruments. And they celebrate this festival that celebrates the orbit of the star with these wonderful, wonderful, beautiful carved masks made out of wood. And these masks have been tested, and they go back at least 1,000 years.
And how about ancient drawings, pictures that depict UFOs in the background, caves that depict astronauts and visitors? All that's fascinating.
All around the world this stuff exists.
Yes.
And that is why, you can't explain this stuff away with fantasy or a figment of the imagination, because for every fantasy story that you create, there had to have been some real spark of inspiration, something real. And to say that, all these ancient descriptions of these gods or these teachers from heaven are nothing else but, natural occurrences like rain, thunder, earthquakes, or wind. I've never been talked to by wind and rain, but these ancient texts always speak that these, occurrences that they were talked to, and that these events happened in a physical, quote-unquote, divine form. So it wasn't nature. It wasn't in their imagination of our ancestors that this stuff happened.
Well, there's no question, Giorgio, that something happened on this planet a long, long time ago, and something is probably happening on Earth-like planets throughout this universe. Who are these people? Are they messengers of God? Who knows what they may be? But there's no doubt something strange happened on planet Earth thousands and thousands of years ago.